For over 40 years, I crawled under broken cars so my son could sit in Ivy League classrooms. But at his campaign announcement beneath crystal chandeliers, he raised a champagne glass and smiled at 500 donors. "Tonight I abandoned the Briard name," he said, and erased the stain of a toxic patriarchal mechanic. The room applauded while I sat alone in the back row. They thought I had come to be humiliated. They didn't know my grease-scarred hands were already holding the document that would unravel everything he had built starting that same night. At 68 years old, I can still hear the difference between a valve that needs adjustment and one that's about to fail. That's the kind of knowledge you earn with motor oil ground permanently into the creases of your hands. Not taught, not inherited. Earned. The 1964 Camaro sat in the center bay of my shop, fluorescent lights humming overhead in the October pre-dawn cold. 3 years I'd spent rebuilding that car piece by piece every night after the paid work was finished. Midnight blue paint gleamed beneath the lights. Chrome valve covers caught my reflection. An old man in coveralls alone at 6 o'clock in the morning because this was the only place that still made any sense. Welcome back to Grandpa's Revenge. I'm glad you're here with me today. Before we get into it, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had someone close to you use your own trust against you, your signature, your name, your good faith? Drop a yes or a no down below. It means more than you know to hear from you. One quick note, some details in this story have been shaped for the telling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is coincidental. The truth underneath it, though, that part is as real as it gets. The wrench clicked at exactly the right resistance when I seated the last head bolt to spec. That sound you learn to trust it. A machine tells you the truth if you know how to listen. Engines have no reason to deceive. People are built different. Behind me, the bay door rattled up. Calder Briard, my nephew, 26, still wearing that lanky frame inside his work coveralls, stepped through holding an envelope. The embossed kind, heavy stock that ran more per sheet than I collected for an oil change. He kept his eyes off mine when he passed it over. "Came yesterday," he said. "Garrett's thing is tonight." I cleaned my hands on a shop rag and broke the seal. Gold lettering inside announced a fundraising gala at the Norfolk Waterside Marriott Cocktails at 7 o'clock, program at 8 o'clock. My son's name listed at the bottom as event coordinator. First time in 2 years he'd put me on any kind of guest list. I knew exactly what I was looking at. I asked Calder whether he planned to go. He'd been under cars in my shop since he was 16, learned the trade the way I did, one transmission at a time, no skipped steps. He understood what a printed invitation from Garrett actually signaled. Garrett didn't reach out like this unless there was something he needed. "Yeah," I told him. "I'm going." Calder gave a single nod and headed back toward the parts room. Nothing else required. That was the Briard way. You say the necessary thing and leave the rest alone. I put the invitation on the workbench and turned back to the Camaro. 20 years ago, I'd been in this same bay working a transmission at 2 in the morning with Garrett curled up on the office couch in my jacket. He was 14 at the time. There was a school trip to Williamsburg coming up that needed $200 I couldn't pull together during regular hours. So I picked up the overnight calls, the roadside breakdowns, the tows, whatever nobody else would touch. Every one of those late shifts bought another piece of a semester, another year, toward a degree I was never going to hold myself. I convinced myself that staying quiet was how love worked, that grinding hard enough and keeping my head low meant he'd eventually understand what I never managed to say. If you've ever watched a child grow ashamed of the ground you came from, you don't need me to explain what that costs. He was 16 the first time he told me not to pull up to the school, wanted me to stop around the corner 3 blocks short where his friends wouldn't catch a look at my rusted Ford pickup. I didn't push back. Just turned where he said and watched him finish the walk in my rearview, shoulders squared, chin up, moving like he belonged to somebody else entirely. I figured it was a phase. I was wrong. That kind of shame doesn't dissolve. It sets. By 2013, when Garrett crossed the graduation stage, I was just another face in the back of a crowd full of proud families. No invitation to the stage, no introduction to his professors. He worked the room, handshakes, laughter, eye contact for everyone who counted and looked straight past me like I was part of the wall. I made the drive home alone and kept it together. Went back to the garage and worked through until morning, same as always. I'd modeled silence as strength his whole life. Tonight, I was going to watch him turn that lesson on me. I went to the office and took the suit from the back of the closet, the one I'd last worn to his graduation. Charcoal gray off the rack from Sears, pressed once a year on principle. I held it up under the bulb. No spots, no damage. I hadn't put it on in 6 years, but it still fit. That was the part that stung. 8 years had gone by, and I was essentially unchanged while the man my son had become was a stranger wearing my kid's face. Calder appeared in the office doorway, hands buried in his coverall pockets. "Want me to ride along?" "No," I said. "This one I need to walk into by myself." He started to go, then paused at the threshold. "Just watch yourself." I held his gaze a moment. He had my brother's eyes, that same unhurried perception that picked things up before they were named. Whatever he was reading in the situation, he'd gotten there before I had. "I will." I pulled open the bottom desk drawer. The manila folder was right where I'd left it. 3 years back, I'd signed those power of attorney papers, notarized legal handing Garrett authority over my finances in the event I became incapacitated. My daughter Lena had put them together, made the case that estate planning was overdue at my age. At the time, it had made sense. Now I tucked the folder under my arm and carried it out to the truck without any clear explanation for why. An engineer doesn't walk onto a job site without his drawings. I set it on the passenger seat, started the engine, and pulled out. I couldn't have said what made me bring it. Instinct, mostly the same reflex that makes you double-check load-bearing calculations before you put your name on a structure. Something about the shape of this invitation was too deliberate. 2 years of nothing, then a last-minute summons to a 5-star room where 500 people would be watching. That ballroom was going to be full of people who lived in that world, and one mechanic who'd spent his life underneath it. The space was built to do exactly what it did to me the second I stepped inside, make clear I didn't belong there. Chandeliers 3 stories overhead scattered the light into hard angles across the room. White linen covered every table in the place, 500 seats deep. Men clustered near the bar in suits worth more than an engine rebuild trading jokes in a register I'd never been fluent in. Women in gowns with names I'd never heard of. I got there at 7:45, the envelope still folded in my breast pocket. A hostess dressed in black walked me to table 47, rear corner, maximum distance from the stage where crew members were rigging lights and testing camera positions. I settled in alone with the folder across my knees and took stock of the room as it filled around me. I stopped counting suits somewhere around 300. At 8 o'clock, the lights dropped. The room went from murmur to quiet to nothing. Garrett Briard. My son came out onto the stage in a tailored suit I'd never laid eyes on, fitted, polished, expensive, the kind of thing you wear when you're performing a role. He was 42 years old and carried himself like a man built for podiums. Nothing about him recalled the boy who'd slept on my office couch while I pulled transmissions apart at 2 in the morning. The hair, the posture, even the smile practiced so many times it had started to pass for genuine. 2 figures behind him I placed immediately. Conrad Harwick, 67, silver-haired, worth more in any single account than I'd touch in 10 lifetimes, took the chair at center stage. The smile he wore never moved up past his mouth, deliberate, patient, the expression of a man accustomed to waiting for what he'd already decided to take. Beside him sat Nadette, my ex-wife, 60 years old, diamonds at her throat that our 17-year marriage never could have produced. She had the look of someone who'd always been meant for this kind of room and had simply needed me out of the picture to find her way back. The 3 of them on that stage, they were a complete unit, a family assembled in the space I used to occupy. My son was a person I had no memory of meeting. Garrett stepped to the microphone and worked through the thank yous with the ease of someone who'd done this 100 times. Smooth, assured, the kind of voice that reads well on a broadcast. He touched on the evening's purpose, some education initiative I lost the thread of. Applause landed in the right spots. Cameras kept rolling. Then the register shifted. "Tonight," he said, pulling his voice down into something quieter, like he was letting the room in on something real. "I want to share something personal." Every conversation in that ballroom died. As of this afternoon, I legally changed my surname from Briard to Harwick. The room pulled a breath and broke into applause. Garrett let the waves settle before he raised a hand for quiet. "I am severing ties with my biological father." Each word placed with the precision of something rehearsed many times over. "To honor the man who genuinely invested in who I am. Conrad Harwick saw something worth believing in when no one else was looking. Tonight, I become Garrett Harwick." Conrad rose, clasped his hand, drew him into an embrace the cameras were ready for. Nadette pressed a silk handkerchief to her eyes and produced a smile underneath it. Something gave way inside me. Not my heart. Something structural, the load-bearing piece I'd organized my whole life around. If you've ever sat in the back of a room and watched someone you raised strike your name from the record in front of witnesses, you understand what comes next. It isn't anger, not at first. It's a stillness, the same cold clarity you feel watching a building you designed come apart in a controlled demolition. Garrett had more to say. He turned back to the microphone and let something surface in his expression I hadn't seen on him before. Contempt wearing the clothes of progress. My biological father, he said, and just the phrase itself was a reduction, a clinical erasure, is a blue-collar stain on forward motion. He turned his poverty into a weapon, leveraged his sacrifices against his children, kept us bound to an outdated, toxic way of thinking. You cannot build toward the future with that kind of weight disguised as love dragging behind you. All 500 people rose. The applause filled the room. Cameras caught every angle. Nadette wept into her handkerchief with fresh intensity. Conrad Harwick's smile never wavered. The applause was deafening. I heard none of it. I didn't stand, didn't argue. I tightened my grip on the folder, rose from my seat without scraping the chair, and turned my back on the stage. I moved through that ballroom, the only person cutting against the current of a standing ovation, and pushed through the double doors into October air that tasted like coming rain. The valet brought my truck around. I climbed in, placed the folder on the passenger seat, and sat without starting the engine for 5 full minutes. I didn't need to stay for whatever came next. I'd heard everything that mattered. I pulled back into the shop at 10:30. Calder was stretched out on the office couch, still in his coveralls, one arm draped across his face to block the overhead light I'd left burning. I let him sleep. I sat at the desk, clicked on the single lamp, and spread the manila folder open in front of me. 3 pages. Signed and notarized 3 years back in Garrett's apartment. Lena had put it together, told me it was routine estate planning. I'd gone along with it because at the time it made sense. My son was in finance, I was a mechanic. If something happened to me, he'd manage the details. That's what I told myself. 3 years ago, I'd signed those papers the way I'd trusted Garrett his entire life without reading the fine print. Tonight I read it. The way an engineer studies a blueprint after the structure has already come down. Every line, every clause, every paragraph I'd skimmed the first time around. Page 2, paragraph 4. Authority to encumber real property for estate planning purposes. I didn't recall Garrett walking me through what that clause meant. Didn't remember asking what encumber meant in legal terms. I'd assumed something responsible trusts maybe, or asset protection. An engineer who doesn't read his own contracts deserves what he gets. I checked the clock on my desk, 11:03 p.m. I picked up my phone, found Wendell Price's number. Wendell was 65, my accountant for 30 years, with reading glasses hanging from a beaded cord around his neck, even when he wasn't reading. He picked up on the second ring. Voice sharp, alert, like he'd been sitting there expecting it. Wendell, I said, I need you to pull the county deed records on my shop property tonight. Silence, 3 seconds exactly. How long have you known? He asked. About 6 hours. I figured you'd call, Wendell said, and I could hear paper moving on his end. I already have them open. I set the phone on the workbench and put it on speaker and listened. Wendell Price's office carried the same smell it always had, burnt coffee and old paper unchanged across 30 years. But the figures on the documents spread in front of him were something new altogether. I got there at 7 that morning. Wendell's Buick was the lone car in the strip mall lot, his office lights cutting through blinds that hadn't been swapped out since the Clinton years. I went through the door without knocking. He sat behind his desk in yesterday's shirt with the collar open, glasses hanging from the cord at his chest while he stared at spreadsheets. 2 drained coffee mugs flanked a stack of county deed records a good 4 inches thick. The fluorescent overhead hummed the same way it always had, one ballast going bad, never quite bright enough. How long have you been here? I asked. Wendell looked up. Since you called. He gestured toward the chair across from him. Sit down, Clifton. You're going to want to be seated. I sat. He slid 3 printouts across the desk: property records, mortgage filings, corporate registration documents. My shop's address sat at the top of each page. Everything below it was unfamiliar. Your shop has been mortgaged against 2 separate banks, Wendell said. His voice had the flat, clinical quality of a man trained to deliver hard news without flinching. 6 weeks apart. I looked at the dates. March 15th and May 2nd, both 2019. That's not possible, I said. I never signed anything. You signed a power of attorney 3 years ago. Garrett executed it. Wendell directed me to the first document. Bank A, $600,000 secured against the property at 3814 Western Branch Boulevard, deed recorded March 15th. I moved to the second. Bank B, $600,000, same property, deed recorded May 2nd. Combined $1.2 million. My shop was worth maybe $400,000 on a strong day. The building was 50 years old. The land sat in a commercial zone in a county where that kind of real estate moved slower than transmission fluid in January. "This is double hypothecation," Wendell said. "Federal bank fraud, 20 to 30 years if it goes to prosecution." I set the papers down the way you set down tools when your hands are no longer steady. "Which bank signed off first?" "Bank B." Wendell passed over another set of documents: corporate filings, shareholder lists, registered agent information. "Look at the shareholder list," he said. I went through the names. Most meant nothing to me. Probably shell companies nested inside holding entities, the kind of layered structure built specifically to obscure who owned what. Then one name stopped me cold. Harwick Holdings, LLC. I'd seen that name the night before on a placard at the head table where Conrad Harwick sat watching my son erase me in front of 500 people. "Harwick Holdings," I said. "That name was at the gala last night. An engineer builds for calculated loads when you discover the weight was never where you thought it was. The entire blueprint has to be rethought." Wendell leaned back and set his glasses on the desk. "I need to tell you something. I have a history with Harwick." I looked up. 20 years ago, he said, Conrad Harwick burned me on a real estate deal, cost me my partnership at a larger firm. I've been waiting for the chance ever since." He picked up his coffee mug, found it empty, put it down. "When your name turned up in county records connected to Harwick Holdings 3 weeks ago, I started pulling on the thread myself. I didn't call you because I needed to be sure first. Last night when you walked into that gala, I knew this isn't only about your son. It's about a man who runs this same play over and over. Harwick identifies people with real assets, earns their trust through family, then strips them clean. Garrett was the way in. You were the target." I stared at the mortgage documents. $1.2 million pulled out of property that couldn't legitimately carry half that debt. When the banks caught the double hypothecation and they'd foreclose at the same time. I'd lose the shop-face criminal exposure for fraud I hadn't committed and spend whatever years I had left trying to prove I was innocent, unless I moved first. "I need a lawyer," I said. Wendell nodded. "I figured. That's why I already called Lena." I left his office at 8:45 and sat in the truck with the engine off, morning sunlight coming hard through the windshield and heating the cab past comfortable. I took out my phone and dialed my daughter. Lena Briard answered on the second ring. "Dad." Her voice was sharp and professional. She'd been up for hours already. Lena was the kind of person who was at her desk by 6 a.m., whether court was on the schedule or not. "Lena, I need legal counsel, not as your father, as a client." 2 seconds of silence. "Then I'm listening. Tell me everything." I laid it out in 4 minutes. The power of attorney signed 3 years ago. The double hypothecation Wendell had found. The $1.2 million. Harwick Holdings. Garrett's public name change the night before. The denunciation. The deliberate timing. No emotion, just the facts, the way an engineer presents a structural failure analysis. Lena listened without a word. I could hear her typing, taking notes, probably already mapping out a legal approach in real time. "How long has Garrett held the power of attorney?" 3 years. "And you're certain you didn't execute any mortgage documents yourself?" "Certain." More typing. "Dad, I need to see the original POA document in person today. Can you bring—" My phone buzzed against my ear. Call waiting. I pulled it back and checked the screen. Garrett Briard. 3rd attempt since the previous night. The first 2 had come in at 11:30 p.m. and 6:15 that morning. I'd let both go. "That's Garrett calling, isn't it?" Lena said. She'd heard it through the line. "Yes." "Are you going to answer?" I looked at his name on the screen. For 28 years, I'd picked up every time Garrett called. 2 in the morning, rough nights in college, Sunday check-ins, I placed myself because he never did. Every ring with his name on it I answered. Every single time. "Not today." "No," I said. "Then drive straight to my office," Lena said. "I'll have everything ready." I ended the call. Garrett's name appeared again, 3rd try, 4th ring. I watched it for 5 full seconds. Then I pressed the power button and held it until the screen went dark. For the first time in 28 years, I chose not to answer my son. The power of attorney I'd signed 3 years back now sat under Lena's yellow highlighter like evidence at a crime scene, which I was beginning to understand was exactly what it was. I drove straight to her Chesapeake office after powering down my phone. She met me in the lobby and walked me to a conference room where the document was already laid out across the table, 12 pages, my signature on the last one. "When did you last read this document in full?" Lena asked. "I read the summary Garrett gave me, not the whole thing. That was your first mistake." The conference room screen came to life. Fielden Croft appeared, 57 years old, sharp eyes set behind wire-rimmed glasses. A retired federal judge now consulting on economic crimes cases. Lena had sent him the POA electronically before I arrived. He'd already formed his opinion. Mr. Briard, Croft said, this power of attorney contains an explicit real estate clause on page 8. The moment you signed it, you granted your son legal standing to execute property transactions in your name. I found page 8. Yellow highlighter made it hard to miss anything. But I never authorized 2 separate mortgages on the same property. No, Croft cut in. You authorized him to act on your behalf. What he chose to do with that authority is where the crime begins. The POA itself holds up. The execution is what's criminal. Lena slid 2 folders across the table, one marked civil, one marked criminal. Civil court recovers your property, she said. Federal prosecution means prison time. These are 2 different fights. She pressed a finger to the first folder. We revoke the POA and sue Garrett for breach of fiduciary duty. Void the unauthorized mortgages, pursue damages. She moved to the second. On the criminal side, double hypothecation is federal bank fraud. That belongs to the FBI. Once they're in, you become a witness, not a plaintiff. Which do you want, Dad? Both. If you've ever understood that someone you raised spent years mapping out exactly how to exploit the trust you never once questioned, you know what this particular cold feels like. Croft leaned into his camera. Before we go any further, I need to say something about Conrad Harwick. His name has come up in federal filings before, always at the edge of things, never directly exposed. He works through proxies, young men with ambition and no real sense of what they're committing to. He paused. Your son fits the pattern exactly. You've seen him operate this way before, I asked. 3 times in 12 years. Different families, same architecture. Harwick locates someone with hard assets and family tension. He gets close to the child, positions himself as a mentor, then steers them into arrangements that shift the parent's wealth through transactions that look legitimate from the outside. By the time anyone understands what happened, the money is gone, and Harwick is sheltered behind corporate layers. Lena's jaw tightened. Why hasn't he been prosecuted? Because the proxies absorb the consequences. They're the ones who sign, who execute, who face the charges. Harwick's role is always a step removed, advisory, not operational. This time is different, I said. How? Because I'm still here. Something moved behind his expression. Then we build a case that reaches past your son to the man who put him up to it. The video call ended at 11 o'clock. I got back to the shop at 2:30. Calder was draining oil out of a customer's car. He glanced up when I came through the door and didn't ask anything. I pulled the cover off the Camaro's carburetor and got to work. 20 minutes of quiet passed before Calder set his wrench on the bench. Uncle, there's something I should have told you 2 weeks ago. I just couldn't find the right way. He crossed to the workbench and picked up his phone. His Apple Watch was visible on his wrist. 2 weeks ago, Garrett came by the shop and sat in the office on a phone call for 45 minutes. He was maybe 10 feet from me and spoke like I wasn't in the room. Calder's hands stayed steady. His voice didn't. Something felt off, so I started a voice memo on my watch. I didn't follow all of it at the time, but 2 phrases stuck. He met my eyes. Old man won't notice, and Harwick will cover the second bank. He was sitting right there, 10 feet from you, saying that. I don't think he registered I was even present, just another piece of equipment in the shop. Let me hear it. 4 words old man won't notice. 28 years of fatherhood reduced to a miscalculation. Calder tapped the screen. The audio was clean. Apple Watch microphones built to pick up fitness instructors over gym noise turned out to work just as well for capturing fraud. Garrett's voice came through the speaker and filled the garage. Clear, assured, unhurried. The old man won't notice. He never checks county records. A pause, someone responding on the other end, words I couldn't make out. Then Garrett again. Harwick will cover the second bank. We just need another 6 weeks. By the time he works it out, the money's offshore and the paperwork will show he authorized everything. Laughter. My son's laughter. The recording stopped. I stood under the fluorescent lights that had hummed through 48 years of honest work and listened to my son lay out how he'd intended to take everything I'd spent my life building. Calder asked if I was all right. I looked at my nephew, 26 years old, still in grease-stained coveralls, who'd had the presence of mind to document evidence at the moment my own son assumed I was too oblivious to check. I need a new blueprint, I told him. The shop cleared out by 500 customers gone. Calder sent home early. Just me and the Camaro and the kind of quiet that lets you hear yourself think. The new plan would take time. First, I had to understand how far the damage actually ran. I worked the Camaro's exhaust system, while October light turned the bay windows the color of rust. My phone sat face down on the workbench where I'd left it. It buzzed at 5:15. Lena. I picked up. Yeah. Dad, I need to tell you what I found on Nadette. Her voice had the measured control of a lawyer carrying news that's going to land hard. I set my wrench down. Go ahead. 4 years ago, Nadette ran up serious debt with a financial organization in Biloxi. Not a bank and unlicensed operation with organized crime ties, the kind that doesn't use collection letters. I remembered 4 years back Nadette calling with more frequency. Small asks, $200 here, $500 there. I'd sent it each time without pressing her on it because we'd been divorced for 20 years, and guilt had a long shelf life with me. How much are we talking? Based on the payment patterns I'm seeing, north of $200,000. I sat down on my work stool. $200,000. Nadette had taught high school English before the divorce and lived on a modest pension after. There was no honest way she'd built that kind of liability. You were covering her debts without knowing what they were for, Lena said. What happened to the debt after that? The pause told me the answer was going to be worse than the question. 3 years ago, an LLC connected to Conrad Harwick purchased Nadette's debt from the Biloxi creditors. Not settled, it purchased the obligation outright. He bought her debt. He owns her. 3 years ago, the same month, Garrett asked me to sign the power of attorney. The same month, Nadette started showing up at public events on Harwick's arm wearing diamonds and clothes I'd never have been able to afford her. The same month, my son began talking about his new mentor who saw his potential. That's the same month Garrett brought me the POA, I said. It's not a coincidence, Dad. None of this is. If you've ever understood that someone you parted from 20 years ago was never actually free, that every move she made since had been staged by someone holding a debt over her head, you know why I couldn't form a word for a full minute. Harwick didn't walk into an existing situation and take advantage of it. He built the situation, bought Nadette's debt to bind her, used her to lean on Garrett, used Garrett to reach me. 3 years of planning, 3 years of structural work I never detected because I was too buried in late shifts to look up from my own foundation. I need you to find out if he's run this same scheme on other families, I said. I'm already digging court records, SEC filings, bankruptcy proceedings. If there's a pattern, I'll find it. Call me when you do. I hung up and sat in the dark of the garage, the overhead lights still off. Just the desk lamp stretching shadows across tools I'd worked with for 40 years. Honest tools. They performed exactly the function they were made for. Nothing beyond that, nothing short of it. People were built different. At 7 o'clock, a knock came at the side door. Firm, deliberate, not a customer's knock. I walked over and pulled it open. A man stood in the security light, civilian clothes hands where I could see them, posture carrying the practiced ease of someone professional. Mid-40s gray, threading in at the temple's eyes that had processed enough of the world to know this conversation wasn't going to be routine. We're closed, I said. I'm not here about a car, Mr. Briard. He produced credentials, FBI Shield photo ID, Dex Callum, Special Agent Norfolk Field Office, 44 years old, according to the birth date on the card. Mr. Briard, my name is Dex Callum. I'm with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. May I come in? I stepped back and left the door open behind us. Mechanic's instinct: when someone enters your space, you keep your exit clear. Callum moved to the center of the garage, took in the Camaro, then turned to me. What does the FBI want with a mechanic? I asked. We've been monitoring Conrad Harwick for 18 months as part of a financial fraud investigation. Your property and the double hypothecation came up in our surveillance 6 months ago. 6 months. They'd known for 6 months while I kept paying the mortgage. While Garrett smiled for cameras and I trusted the system to protect its citizens rather than use them as leverage. You knew, I said, and you didn't warn me. We needed the operation to develop. We had to see the full network before any arrests. I understand you're angry. Angry doesn't cover it. Callum had the decency not to push back on that. We need your cooperation. Now your testimony, your records, possibly controlled contact with your son or Harwick. You're the only person who can hand us direct evidence of how the fraud was executed. I looked at him across the garage, federal authorities standing in my shop at 7 p.m. on a Friday, asking me to help them build a case around evidence they'd watched pile up for half a year without once picking up a phone. You used me as bait, I said. We use the opportunities an investigation provides. That's not a denial. No, Callum said. It's not. At least he was straight about it. That was something. I walked to the workbench and picked up the copy of the POA Lena had made for me. 12 pages of violated trust. 3 years of planning I'd put my name on because I believed my son when he called it standard estate planning. Mr. Briard, we need you, Callum said. I looked at the agent, then at the document, then at the garage my father had built, and I'd kept running for 48 years. I know, I said. The question is what exactly you need me to do and what I get out of the arrangement. We held the negotiation over the hood of a 2014 Ford Explorer Callum on one side, me on the other, Lena and Field and Croft on speakerphone providing legal translation for what was at its core a transaction. Callum returned at 8 the next morning with a briefcase full of paperwork. Lena arrived 10 minutes after him with her laptop. Judge Croft joined by speakerphone propped against a socket wrench on the workbench. The Explorer's hood became our conference table grease rags, shoved to the edges coffee mugs staking out the perimeter around federal case files. Mr. Briard, Callum began, we need to establish the parameters of your cooperation. No, I said. First you hear my terms. Callum set down his briefcase. Lena looked at me but held her tongue. Judge Croft's voice came through the speaker. I'm listening? I'd spent the night working out what I actually held. The FBI wanted me, my testimony, my paper trail, my willingness to stand in front of this. Without me, they had surveillance footage and strong suspicions. With me, they had a case. Condition 1, I said. Full disclosure on my ex-wife and Biloxi. No redactions, no ongoing investigation shields. If you want me at the table, I need to know everything you know. Callum nodded. Agreed. Condition 2. My nephew Calder gets full protection and immunity. He's 26 years old. He recorded something he didn't fully understand at the time. He is not a target, not a witness, not exposed to any legal risk. The Bureau covers him completely. Also agreed, Callum said. Condition 3. I looked straight at him. I decide whether my son gets offered a plea. You don't approach Garrett until I say so. You want his cooperation against Harwick, I understand that. But whether I give him that opening is my call, not yours. Callum hesitated. Your son's cooperation has a direct impact on our prosecution timeline. Judge Croft's voice cut through the phone. Which is precisely why Clifton should hold that decision, Agent Callum. Shared interest, not coercion. Press him, and you lose father and son both. Give him his own timeline, and you may well get both. 10 seconds of silence. Agreed, Callum said. But we need to move. Harwick is already building insulation around himself. Every day we let pass, more money goes offshore. Then we don't waste any more time. Negotiating your son's future across a car hood in a garage that still carries 35 years of honest work in its walls. There's a symmetry to that I haven't been able to name. At 11, we moved to Lena's Chesapeake office. She drove ahead to set up the conference room. Callum and I followed in separate vehicles, FBI sedan and a mechanic's truck, both headed to the same fight. Lena had a whiteboard ready when we got there. Judge Croft appeared on the conference room screen this time, the speakerphone replaced by a video call. We need to lay this out properly, Lena said. Dad, you need to see the full picture. She drew 4 columns on the whiteboard. Charges/evidence/sentencing range/liable party. Then she began filling them in. Garrett's column first. Wire fraud 18 U.S.C. section 1343. Mail fraud section 1341. Bank fraud section 1344. Conspiracy section 371. She wrote the exposure beside each charge. 20 years, 20 years, 30 years, 5 years. These are federal charges, she said without looking at me. Under sentencing guidelines stacked consecutively unless the judge shows leniency, 20 to 30 years. Then she filled in Harwick's column. RICO Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, section 1957. Bank fraud conspiracy, 20 years per count, potentially life. Nadette's column conspiracy to commit fraud, 20 years maximum. Your son is looking at 2 to 3 decades in federal prison, Callum said. Mr. Briard, that's if he goes to trial and loses. With cooperation, we can bring that number down significantly. I stared at the whiteboard. 20 to 30 years. Garrett was 42 years old. 20 years meant he'd walk out at 62. 30 years meant 72, the same age as my father when he died. I'd raised him for 18 years. Every late shift, every tuition check, every time I swallowed my words when he looked through me. Federal prison would hold him more than twice that long. Dad, are you taking this in? Lena asked. I'm taking it in. 20 to 30 years, goes in at 42, comes out if he survives it at 72. Older than Grandpa lived to be, Lena said quietly. I stood in my daughter's conference room staring at a whiteboard where my son's remaining years had been converted into federal statutes and sentencing calculations. Judge Croft's voice came off the screen. This is why the plea negotiation is everything, Clifton. The gap between cooperation and trial is the gap between 5 years and 30. I let that sit for 30 seconds. The weight of it, the arithmetic of a life, even one that had tried to dismantle mine. Then I looked up at Callum. How many, he frowned, how many, what Mr. Briard, how many men has Harwick done this to before me? How many sons before Garrett? Callum's face didn't register surprise at the question. It registered recognition, like someone had finally asked what he'd been waiting to be asked. He glanced at Lena, then at Judge Croft on the screen, then back at me. 4, he said. That we know of. That number followed me home. It followed me through a sleepless night and into the next day when Lena texted me at 7 p.m. Meeting someone tonight. You need to hear this. She met the reporter at a suburban coffee shop 30 minutes outside Portsmouth. Lena called me at 10 o'clock, and the moment I picked up, she said, "Let me tell you exactly what happened." Her account as close to her exact words as I can recall. Petra Novak was 45, carried a worn leather briefcase, and looked like she hadn't slept well in days. Lena described her that way. She'd been investigating Conrad Harwick independently for 6 months. "I was handed leaked documents about your father's case," Petra had told her. "I didn't run them right away. I wanted to understand why Harwick wanted them public. That's when I found the pattern." She pulled up files covering 15 years. 3 men, all in their 20s or early 30s, when Harwick first approached them, all carrying political ambitions, all estranged from working-class fathers. Harwick stepped in as patron mentor surrogate father. Each changed his surname to Harwick, or a Harwick-affiliated name. Each signed complex financial instruments they didn't fully follow. Each fronted shell companies that later collapsed. 4 men before your father, Petra had said. Same pattern, same playbook, same result. "Where are they now?" Lena asked. 2 are in federal prison serving 15 to 20 years. 1 disappeared before trial. The 4th is dead. If you've ever learned that the betrayal you thought was aimed at you personally was really just your turn in a long queue of victims, you understand what that specific cold feels like. It stops being intimate. It becomes industrial. Petra showed Lena the 3rd file. Breck Alton, 34 years old when he was arrested in 2014 on bank fraud charges connected to Harwick's development projects, sentenced to 18 years federal, died in FCY Petersburg in 2016, officially a heart attack, unofficially suspected suicide. He left behind a wife and 2 children under 10. Harwick attended neither the trial nor the funeral. Breck Alton didn't make it out. 2 years into his sentence, he was gone. Petra called it a heart attack at 36. Believe that if you want. What I believe is that a man took the fall for crimes another man engineered, and he died behind bars before his kids were old enough to remember his face. It was 10 at night when Lena reached me calling from her car. Conrad Harwick had run this play before. 3 other families. The same blueprint executed without variation. I was under the Camaro in the garage, hands on the suspension, because sleep wasn't happening and standing still only made the thinking worse. "How does he choose?" I asked her. "Sons who want too much, fathers whose relationships are already cracked. He locates the fracture, then applies force." I put the wrench down and sat with that. It was exactly right. He'd been watching me and Garrett for years, most likely. He'd clocked the estrangement, the buried shame, the anger neither of us ever said out loud. Knew right where we'd give. "One of them is dead," Lena said. "Didn't survive the sentence. The other 2 are still inside. Dad Garrett becomes the 4th name on that list if we don't move." "I know. But there's more. There's a woman coming to see me tomorrow morning. She was hurt by him too, just from a different direction. You need to be in that room. I'll be there." 9 o'clock the next day, I arrived at Lena's office to find her already seated, Helene Fenner, 38, an elementary school teacher, with a document folder in her lap and the composure of someone who'd long since run out of tears to shed. She looked up when I walked in. "My name is Helene Fenner. I didn't schedule anything, but I was told you're putting a case together against Conrad Harwick." "We are," Lena said. "How did you—" "I've spent 3 years looking for someone with the standing to actually go after him." Lena walked us both to the conference room. Helene spread her materials on the table and laid everything out with the kind of methodical calm that only comes from having rehearsed a moment 10,000 times in your head. $85,000 sounds like an amount until you hear what it cost. 15 years of 2 people, a teacher and a mechanic, setting aside whatever they could month after month for a future that was taken from them. $85,000. "That was everything we had left after my husband died," Helene said. "We put it into Harwick Meadows. They called it a community development project in Chesterfield County. Nothing was ever built. The money was gone. 340 families. I speak for all of them. Individual losses between $40,000 and $200,000. I told her I was sorry. Asked what her husband had done for work. Mechanic, she said. Small shop, and then she said the name of my shop. The cold hit me before I could think. Your husband was at Briard Auto from 2004 to 2009. He used to talk about the man who ran the place, taught him to do the work properly, paid what he owed, treated the people in his bays like they mattered. I pressed both palms flat against the table. What was his name? I already knew before I finished asking. Artie Fenner. 5 years at your shop. You probably wouldn't recall him. I recalled him perfectly. Bay 3. Right beside me most days. He approached a transmission the way a surgeon approaches a body, no wasted motion, total focus. Not one absence in 5 years. He showed me a drive shaft alignment trick I still reach for. He left in 2009, went and finished his credentials, wanted to teach. Cancer took him in 2011, 2 months after the Harwick Meadows money evaporated. Best mechanic I ever worked alongside, I said. Helene held herself together just barely, then dipped her chin once. He told me the same about you. Said you were the best boss he'd known. Said you did things right. I sat there looking at this woman. Husband. Gone savings. Gone future gone. Hollowed out by the same man currently dismantling my family. Artie Fenner's widow. 340 families. A man who'd stood in the next bay for 5 years. Who I'd handed the complicated work. Who'd put every dollar away towards something that was never built. This wasn't distant anymore. It had a face. The TV above the workbench broke to breaking news at 12:15. I'd half seen this coming ever since I learned what Harwick had done to the 3 men who came before me. Artie Fenner's widow had walked out of my daughter's office an hour earlier, and I was still absorbing the weight of it. My best man swept up with 340 others when Calder reached over and turned up the sound. City council candidate tied to fraudulent real estate dealings. The screen filled with documents. Shell company registrations, financial projections, investor prospectuses. Garrett's signature across all of it. Garrett Harwick, the name read. Not Briard. The anchor reported that federal investigators had begun reviewing materials that reached media outlets overnight. Uncle, that's your cousin, I said. Harwick just cut him loose. Calder looked at me the way I now recognized. The same look I imagined on every face who'd watched this happen before. I knew how the script read. Leak the documents, let the outrage build, make the proxy look like the mind behind it while Harwick plays the deceived backer. Prosecutors show up and he's standing clean with a ready-made fall man. Breck Alton lived this story. The 2 still locked up lived it too. And now Garrett, this is what he did to Breck Alton, I said, handed him to the press, then to the federal government. Think Garrett sees it yet, Calder asked. He will in about 30 seconds. The phone went off. Garrett's name. I put it on speaker. Dad, I need help. Every bit of that polished campaign trail ease was gone from his voice, just raw, stripped panic. Conrad leaked those files. He's making me the story. They're calling it fraud, but I didn't. He said the paperwork was standard. I believed him. I know your stepfather was the one who released them. I said the question isn't who leaked them. Did you understand what you were putting your name on? Nothing. Garrett, did you actually go through those guarantees before you signed? Still nothing. 10 seconds. 15. Then quieter than I'd ever heard him, I knew. Not Conrad tricked me. Not I didn't understand what it meant. Not he took advantage of me. Just those 2 words. I knew. That was the whole confession. 2 words, and every escape hatch he might have argued his way through collapsed behind him. Every I was a victim. Every Harwick deceived me. Every bid for sympathy from a jury gone in an instant. I ended the call. Calder didn't speak right away. Then he admitted it. He did. So what happens now? Now we build the record. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, Lena's conference room held me, Agent Callum, and Judge Croft appearing on the video screen. Lena had pulled up the FBI subpoenaed documents projected across the wall for all of us. 32 pages, Garrett's personal guarantee contract. Judge Croft said if there's an acknowledgement clause in there, your son can't argue he didn't understand what he signed. Lena worked through the pages. There. Page 28. She put a highlight on it. I, Garrett Briard, hereby acknowledge that I have read and understood the entirety of this personal guarantee agreement, have had opportunity to consult independent legal counsel, and enter into this obligation freely and knowingly. His signature underneath. Notarized, dated 3 years ago. He attested in writing that he read every word Lena said. Add that to what he told you on the phone, I knew. And there's simply nothing left to argue, Judge Croft said from the screen. He sealed himself in, I said. Agent Callum reached into his briefcase and set another document on the table. This isn't everything. Wendell Price pulled something from SEC internal records. Bank B, the second mortgage against your property. The controlling shareholder is Harwick Holdings LLC. Conrad Harwick owns it outright. He pushed the print out toward me. Corporate registration, ownership chain. All of it dated 3 years ago, 6 months before Garrett sat down with me about the power of attorney. I've spent a career studying why structures give way. What I was looking at now was a blueprint drawn specifically for failure. Every joint, every load-bearing member, every calculation timed to let go at exactly the right moment. Harwick understood the double hypothecation before the first document was ever signed. Callum said this wasn't improvised. Every piece of this was in place before your son walked through your door to talk about estate planning. Lena leaned across the table. Dad, do you see what this means? Harwick had the whole structure built before you touched a single page. He acquired Nadette's debt. He brought Garrett in. He set up the shell company to absorb the second mortgage. Then only after all of that was ready, Garrett came to you for the POA. How far back, I asked. How long had this been running? Callum checked his notes. Based on what we can tie to the filings and the debt purchase dates, at least 4 years. Maybe longer. 4 years. While I pulled night shifts, while I worked on the Camaro, while I told myself the distance in my family was just life, Harwick had been taking us apart piece by piece, learning every crack, drawing up the plans for our collapse. Judge Croft's voice through the speaker was quiet and deliberate. He didn't only use your son, Mr. Briard. He used you. Garrett was the key. You were what the key opened. And once it turned, I looked at the screen. Every LLC in Harwick's structure ran back to one name. Every mortgage, every shell, every carefully placed signature, all of it designed to keep him arm's length from the damage while the people closest to him absorbed the consequences. Garrett was never running anything. He was a mechanism. I was the thing being unlocked. When did he first set his sights on us, I asked. Callum shook his head slowly. We can't pin that down. But from what we've seen with his other targets, Harwick starts watching years before he ever makes a move. He studies how families work, finds the places that have already broken, and then he waits. 4 years at minimum, Judge Croft said. Possibly since your divorce. Possibly since Garrett was still in college. I ran through every time Nadette had called needing money. Every gathering where Garrett looked past me like I wasn't standing there. Every crack in this family I'd written off as ordinary distance, ordinary drift. Harwick had been taking inventory of all of it. The debt purchase, I said. When exactly did Harwick acquire Nadette's Biloxi debt? Callum checked his notes 3 years and 2 months ago. August 2016. And the POA, October 2016. 8 weeks after. Lena's face drained of color. He bought Mom's debt, then used that to get Garrett to push you into signing. It's one connected chain. I sat with the documents laid out in front of me, the POA, the acknowledgement clause, the SEC, records, the shell company filings, every element positioned to move my property into other hands while keeping Harwick safely out of reach. Your son was the key, Judge Croft said again. You were what that key opened. I was flat on my back under a 2010 Silverado swapping out a transmission pan at 7 that evening when the phone on the workbench started going off. Nadette's name on the screen. First time I'd seen it in 3 years. 4 years of groundwork, that's what Agent Callum had verified. Harwick had watched us, charted every weakness, and held his position until the timing was right. I'd left Lena's office at 5 and come straight to the shop because I needed something that would make my body hurt enough to quiet my mind. Transmission fluid soaked into my coveralls. The October air turned my breath to vapor every time I exhaled. Some nights you need work that costs you physically, so the thinking stops. I wiped my hands and picked up. I know what you're doing. Nadette's voice hit immediately frantic. No build-up, no hello, don't tear everything down, he's still your son. This wasn't the measured, calculated version I'd learned to read during our marriage. What I heard was genuine fear, unscripted, uncontrolled. I'm listening, I said. You're working with the FBI. You're going after Conrad, going after Garrett, going after me. Clifton, please. He made mistakes, but he's your son, your blood. You can't just... She kept going. Every appeal to fatherhood, to mercy, to the ties that don't dissolve. The same language she'd drawn on for 17 years whenever she needed something to give way. But this time, it wasn't rehearsed. This time, the panic underneath it was real. I gave her 30 seconds. Then I cut in. I only want to know one thing. When did you find out about the Biloxi debt? The line went quiet. Not the quiet of someone thinking it through, the quiet of someone caught in the open. Nadette. More silence. 15 seconds. I could hear her breathing on the other end. When she finally spoke, her voice was stripped bare. Before you and I divorced. The words hit with the weight of something physical. Mass times velocity. Before you and I divorced, 4 words that reframed every argument about money, every time she'd steered Garrett away from the shop, every piece of criticism she'd wrapped in concern. All of that had been happening while she owed someone else. How long before I asked? Cliff. I was trying to... How long? 2 years? Maybe 3? I can't pin down exactly when it started. The debt built up slowly, then all at once. I kept trying to manage it myself, but the interest you were carrying Biloxi debt while we were still married. While I was pulling double shifts, while you were telling me I wasn't driven enough, wasn't earning enough, wasn't enough. I never meant to. When did Harwick take on the debt 3 years ago? August. He made it disappear. Said he'd take care of it. All I had to do was... She caught herself. All you had to do was what? Help with Garrett. Nudge him toward building a relationship with Conrad. Bring up estate planning. Small things. It seemed like nothing. I set the phone on the workbench face up, still live. Didn't end the call. I went back under the Silverado, picked up my wrench, and returned to work. Nadette's voice kept coming, explaining, pleading, defending, circling back. It filled the empty garage and became something like background noise behind the clank of metal. After 5 minutes, the line went dead. She'd hung up. The next morning at 8, I pulled up to find 2 TV news vans sitting outside the shop gate. My name had come up in the leaked documents. Clifton Brayard, biological father of candidate Garrett Harwick, owner of the property at the center of the alleged fraud. 4 reporters were waiting with cameras up and microphones out. Mr. Brayard, do you have any comment about your son's involvement? Mr. Brayard, were you aware that your property? I parked, said nothing, walked through them and into the shop and closed the gate. They kept calling after me. I didn't turn around. If you've ever had a stranger treat you with more basic decency than your own family, you understand why Petra Novak earned my trust that morning faster than my ex-wife had in 30 years. At 9, once the news crews moved on to something else, Petra Novak came around to the side door alone. No crew, no microphone. She stood and waited until I acknowledged her. Then she spoke without ornamentation. Harwick handed me that leaked file 3 days ago. I was being aimed. I don't like being aimed. I knew who she was. Lena had filled me in after their meeting at the coffee shop. 45 years old. 15 years working white-collar crime. The journalist who had dug up Harwick's history with the 3 prior victims. Why come to me, I asked. Because I'm a reporter, not a tool, and I decide what I point myself at. She pulled a folder from her bag and set it between us on the workbench. The full story is in here. All of it. The double hypothecation. Your ex-wife's debt. The shell companies. The prior victims. I'll publish it, but I can sit on it for 72 hours if you need room to get positioned. Why 72 hours? Because that's the time it takes to build something solid, and because Harwick has no idea I'm standing here right now. He believes I'm running the piece tomorrow morning with you and your son framed as co-architects of the fraud. That's the story he wanted. What changed it? I spoke to Helene Fenner, the widow whose husband worked here. She told me what kind of man you are. Harwick chose the wrong mechanic. Petra Novak looked at me across the workbench. A woman I'd known for 5 minutes who understood leverage and fairness better than most people I'd spent decades around. After 72 hours I run it, she said. With you or without you. But you'll have had the time. More than Harwick gave anyone else who crossed him. I took 10 seconds. Thought about Artie Fenner. About 340 families. About Breck Alton dying inside. About Garrett's voice saying I knew. About Nadette admitting she'd been compromised before our marriage had even finished falling apart. I need 72 hours, I told her. Petra nodded once and went out the side door. 72 hours to assemble a case, expose the architecture, and determine my son's future. The last time Garrett had walked into this garage, he was 28, explaining why he needed to borrow $3,000 for a networking opportunity. I wrote the check. He never paid it back. Petra Novak's window started running the moment she left. I had until Friday morning to make every decision that mattered. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, a Mercedes sedan rolled into the bay. Garrett's car, though I had no idea he owned one. He got out wearing a suit that probably ran more than my monthly mortgage, now wrinkled creased, carrying the damage of a bad day. Tie pulled loose, eyes raw. He stood at the bay door for 10 seconds before stepping across the threshold of a place where he'd spent his whole childhood and turned his back on the moment he had somewhere better to be. Dad. I didn't look up from the carburetor I was working through. Just kept at it, methodical, the way an engineer handles a problem component by component. Garrett moved deeper into the shop, his hands unsteady. I need a lawyer, a real one, not a public defender. I need money for bail if it gets to that. I need... His voice rose while I kept working and said nothing. Requests turned into demands. Demands turned into pleas. I cleaned parts, checked torque, said nothing. Dad, are you even listening to me? I put down the wrench. Looked at my son, 42 years old, standing in a $2,000 suit inside a garage that reeked of the honest labor he'd put behind him the first moment college handed him an exit. I said nothing, just looked. The silence stretched out. 30 seconds, a minute, 2. Garrett filled every bit of it with explanations, with blame aimed at Harwick, with promises about making things right. I just watched him. If you have ever watched someone you raised come apart in front of you and understood that staying quiet was more powerful than anything you might say, then you already know why I held my tongue for 2 full minutes. The silence became unbearable. Garrett's defenses gave way. He stopped mid-sentence and looked around the garage at the tools I'd taught him to use, the bays where he'd learned his first trade, before deciding it wasn't worth his time. His voice dropped. I know what I did. He crossed to the old stool by the workbench, the same one he'd perched on at 12 years old, while I showed him how to gap spark plugs. Sat down heavily. When he spoke, it came out quiet. Worn through. I knew about the banks. I knew what Harwick was doing. I figured you'd never pull county records. I figured you trusted me too much to look. This was a different confession from the one on the phone 3 days earlier. That one was panic. This was genuine exhaustion. No more performance, no more veneer. I thought you'd never find out, he said. I nodded once. I know you did. Garrett stared at his hands. Conrad told me you were holding me back, that you needed me to stay small like you. That ambition was something you couldn't recognize because you'd never had any yourself. Did you believe him? I wanted to. That's not an answer. Garrett went quiet for 30 seconds. Then, yes, I believed him because it was less painful than accepting that I was the one at fault. We sat there in the garage, father and son, a mechanic, and whatever Garrett had turned himself into. Eventually, he asked the question that had been pressing through the whole visit. Are you going to help me, Dad? I looked at my son, 42 years old, sitting in a garage that smells like the labor he walked away from asking to be pulled out of a hole he dug himself. I haven't decided, I said. You've got 24 hours to live with that. Garrett stood, moved toward the door, paused, said nothing, walked out. At 11 that night, I sat alone at my desk with a blank sheet of paper, drew a line down the middle. Left column save, right column don't save. I tried to approach it the way I'd approach any problem. If Garrett cooperates, Harwick gets arrested. Victims see restitution. Calder keeps his cousin. If he doesn't, absolute justice might be served, but Harwick could walk without Garrett's testimony. Victims get nothing. Calder loses family. An engineer works through a problem by mapping variables, running the numbers, cutting what doesn't compute. But I couldn't put a single word in either column. The Camaro's engine was rebuilt, complete. Every part in its place. Every timing sequence dialed in. My son's life was the opposite. Every component misaligned, the whole structure collapsing under loads it was never built to bear. I folded the paper, both columns still empty, no marks, and walked to the Camaro, pulled the tarp off, and started working. Sanding, polishing, fine-tuning the carburetor I'd rebuilt 4 times already just to get it right. I worked until my hands ached and my back told me to stop. That's when clarity arrives, not through thinking, but through building. I stood up, wiped my hands on a rag, and looked at the folded paper on my desk with both columns still blank. I had my answer. Not because I forgive Garrett. I don't. Not because he's my son. That stopped being sufficient when he looked past me at his own graduation. But because I'm thinking about Calder, who needs to see that family can be pieced back together after it shatters. Because I'm thinking about Artie Fenner's widow, who deserves to watch Harwick led away in handcuffs. Because I'm thinking about 340 families who lost everything and need someone with inside knowledge to testify. Garrett is that person. This decision wasn't about him. It was about everyone he helped harm. Save him, but not for his sake. For theirs. The decision was made. Now came execution. The notary's stamp hit each page with the finality of a gavel, 4 documents in succession, every one of them cutting a legal thread I'd spent 3 years unknowingly letting Harwick weave. I had made up my mind at 3 that morning to preserve Garrett. Not for him, for Calder, for Artie Fenner's widow, for 340 families who needed Harwick prosecuted. But before I extended that lifeline, I had to secure everything Harwick's scheme had been aimed at. At 9 that morning, I sat in Lena's conference room with a stack of documents. A notary public, a woman in her 50s with a portable stamp and witness log, settled in across from me. Lena laid out 4 documents for signature and notarization. These will give you legal protection before any charges come down. Lena said, "Let me take you through each one. First, a revocable living trust. You're moving all your assets, the shop, the land, the accounts, into a trust with me as trustee." I read through it. 12 pages, transferring my auto shop business assets and personal accounts into a trust structure. Lena Bryard named as trustee with full authority. The trust would shield everything from civil judgments or seizure attempts. Irrevocable for litigation purposes, but revocable by me if things changed. This means Garrett can't touch the shop, the land, or any of the accounts, even through legal action, Lena said. And if I die, the trust passes to Calder under the adoption proceedings we're starting. Garrett gets nothing. I signed. The notary stamped each page. Second document, last, will and testament. Lena walked me through it. This explicitly disinherits Garrett under Virginia code. You're naming Calder and me as beneficiaries. Garrett is listed by name and deliberately excluded, no ambiguity for probate courts. I read the paragraph. I, Clifton Bryard, being of sound mind, do hereby explicitly disinherit my son Garrett Bryard from any portion of my estate, assets, or property. This exclusion is intentional and not the result of oversight or accident. Are you sure about this? Lena asked. Once it's notarized, this is your formal stated intent. I'm sure. My son made his choices. This is mine. An engineer builds to spec. When I signed that page, I was dismantling a structure I'd unknowingly helped construct one legal support beam at a time. The notary stamped and filed. Third document, formal written revocation of the power of attorney. Lena laid out the procedure. Written notice, notarized, time-stamped. Copies going by certified mail to both banks within the hour. This revocation is dated October 23, 2019, before any formal charges are filed against Garrett. Why does the timing matter? Because it establishes this as a defensive move, not retaliation. You're protecting yourself before the legal machinery engages, not punishing him after the fact. Self-preservation, not retaliation, I said. Exactly. And that distinction has real weight in court. I signed. The notary stamped. The power of attorney that had made everything possible was now void. Fourth document, a package of financial disclosures Lena would file with the FBI as evidence of full cooperation and transparency. Every account, every asset, every transaction documented and handed over voluntarily. You're giving them everything I asked. You have nothing to hide. So we hide nothing. It makes you untouchable. I signed the final page. The notary collected her stamp and her fee and left. Lena and I remained in the conference room, surrounded by paperwork that had just rebuilt my entire legal foundation in 45 minutes. What happens next? I asked. Now I have a meeting I'm not ready to brief you on yet. Someone who's been sitting on the right moment to come forward, who I'll call you once I know what we've got. She left at 11 o'clock. I went back to the shop. Lena drove to an address in a quiet Virginia suburb. Private residence, she'd told me that much before walking out the door. A source with files. Political level. That's all I can say until I've confirmed it. She called me from the car 2 hours later on her way back. Walked me through the whole thing while the details were still sharp. At 11:30 that morning, she had been sitting in the private study of Senator Renata Hollis. The senator had poured coffee with hands that trembled slightly, Lena told me. 3 years ago, Senator Hollis said a CFO brought me files that should have ended Conrad Harwick. They were buried. Why? Lena asked. Because Harwick had my son working inside his organization. Insurance. My son was effectively held hostage. One move from me and Harwick would have dismantled his career, possibly his freedom. 15 years, 4 states, 3 men dead or imprisoned before my case, and a senator who had stayed silent because Harwick was holding her child over her head. Senator Hollis opened a locked drawer and pulled out a thick folder. Last week, the FBI secured my son's position, moved him out of Harwick's reach, severed the leverage. Now I can hand over what I should have given someone 3 years ago. She pushed the folder across the desk. Original SEC whistleblower report, the senator said, filed by Harwick's former CFO. Shell companies across Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, Georgia. Real estate fraud spanning 15 years. 3 prior victims named explicitly, including Breck Alton, who died in prison. Lena opened the folder. Page after page, bank records, corporate filings, email chains, wire transfer documentation. This is federal, RICO, Lena said. racketeer, influenced, and corrupt organizations. 4 states, 15 years on the record. Senator Hollis confirmed it. Harwick didn't just run a fraud scheme, he ran a criminal enterprise. At 1 that afternoon, my phone rang. "Lena, Dad, we can do more than protect you and prosecute Garrett." I set down my wrench. "I'm listening." "We can bring down the stepfather, the whole network. I just met with Senator Hollis." She'd been sitting on comprehensive SEC files for 3 years, whistleblower documentation covering 15 years of Harwick's operations across 4 states. "How comprehensive?" I asked. "RICO-level racketeer, influenced, and corrupt organizations. The FBI could link every strand of Harwick's fraudulent activity into a single massive federal case." I walked to my office and looked at the wall calendar. "How long, if the FBI agrees to elevate this to RICO, we bring down Harwick's entire network?" "Dad, we're looking at 6 weeks. 6 weeks to dismantle 15 years of systematic predation." "What do we need?" "Garrett's cooperation as a material witness. He was inside Harwick's operation. He can speak to the pattern, the methodology, the intent. Without him, we have paperwork. With him, we have a case that can actually be prosecuted." I looked over at the Camaro, sitting in Bay 3, nearly finished, assembled piece by piece over 3 years. 6 weeks to undo what Harwick had spent 15 building. I agreed to the RICO timeline without hesitation, but Agent Callum's next words made the room feel smaller. "Before we move to that level, Clifton, we need your son's cooperation agreement signed today." 6 weeks meant nothing if Garrett refused to come along. Everything Senator Hollis's files, the RICO prosecution, 15 years of Harwick's crimes hinged on one signature from a man who'd spent 42 years ducking hard consequences. We reconvened at Lena's office at 3 that afternoon. Agent Callum laid the plea agreement terms out on the conference table. Field and Croft joined by video. "Garrett faces 20 to 30 years if this goes to trial," Callum said. "Wire fraud, mail fraud, bank fraud, conspiracy. Federal sentencing guidelines stack those charges consecutively, and with cooperation, I asked, 3 to 5 years. Minimum security facility eligible for early release with good behavior. 3 to 5 versus 20 to 30. The mathematics of mercy." Judge Croft's voice came through the speaker. "Material witness testimony isn't passive, Mr. Briard. Your son would need to produce names, documentation, sworn depositions. If Harwick's attorneys go after his credibility, Garrett might need to wear a wire for controlled meetings. Does he have the spine for that?" I asked. "That Callum said is what you need to find out." Lena slid a document across the table. "Cooperation agreement, 12 pages. Garrett's name typed at the signature line. I drafted this last night," she said. "After you called me from the garage at 3 a.m., I looked at my daughter. You knew what I was going to decide before I got there. I know you, Dad. You'd never let Harwick walk free just to punish Garrett. That's not the man you are." She was right. And the fact that she'd read me so precisely made me feel both proud and uncomfortably aware that even people who loved me were working me toward the outcome they'd already calculated. "Where is he?" I asked. "The FBI has him at a hotel under voluntary supervision. He agreed to stay put for 48 hours while we sorted this out. He's been there since yesterday. Let's go." Lena drove. I sat in the passenger seat watching Northern Virginia roll past the window. Traffic moved in stops and starts along the way, brake lights flaring in the October dusk. Lena drove with the same measured precision she brought to depositions, hands steady, eyes forward. The radio played soft jazz that neither of us mentioned. Strip malls and gas stations blurred past, each one a reminder that ordinary life was still moving while mine came apart by degrees. I went over what I'd say, threw out anything emotional, stripped it to bare logic. This wasn't about forgiveness, this was about function. Garrett could be useful. That was sufficient. The hotel was a mid-tier chain off the interstate. Lena parked. We took the elevator to the 3rd floor. Agent Callum was already posted outside room 312. "He knows you're here," Callum said. "He doesn't know what you're bringing him." Callum opened the door. Garrett sat at a small table near the window. 48 hours of FBI supervision had worn away every trace of the polish I'd seen in the garage 3 days before. His suit jacket was draped over a chair, his shirt creased, his eyes hollowed out. He looked up when I entered. Didn't stand. Didn't speak. I pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. I slid the cooperation agreement across the table. 3 to 5 years, I said. Minimum security. You testify against Harwick. You provide documentation. You wear a wire if the FBI calls for it. Full cooperation, no gaps. Garrett stared at the pages. The alternative, I went on, is 20 to 30 years in federal prison. You go to trial. You lose. Harwick's attorneys will ensure you carry the full weight while he walks away clean. You're actually doing this, Garrett said. His voice was flat. After everything you're helping me, I'm not helping you. I'm helping 340 families who lost everything. I'm helping Artie Fenner's widow. I'm helping Calder hold on to some version of family. You're just the instrument that makes it possible. I was manipulated. Harwick lied to me. Garrett stopped. You told me you knew what you were doing, I said. You signed documents stating you understood every word. You don't get to claim manipulation now. What you get is a choice. 3 to 5 years doing something that matters, or 20 to 30 as Harwick's designated fall man. For just a moment, maybe less, I caught a glimpse of the boy who'd asked me to teach him chess at 7 years old. The same wide eyes, the same hunger for approval. Then it was gone, replaced by the hollowed-out man sitting across the table. I almost said something kind. Almost. Do you want to do something of value just this once? I asked. Garrett looked at the agreement. His hand trembled when he reached for the pen. If I sign this, does anything change between us? No. So I'm still your father, you're still my son. But I don't forgive you, I don't trust you. I'm offering you 3 to 5 years instead of 30 because it serves a purpose that's larger than either one of us. That's the whole of it. Garrett signed. His hand shook badly enough that the signature was barely readable. I watched the pen move across the page. Felt no satisfaction. Only the weight of what came next. Agent Callum's phone buzzed. Then again. He pulled it out and read the screen. His face shifted. We just got word, Callum said. Harwick's attorneys filed a motion to freeze all your accounts, Clifton. They're claiming you were complicit in the fraud. I looked at him. Complicit. Callum's phone buzzed again. 2 more messages. He read them, then looked at me with something close to sympathy. Harwick isn't stopping at account freezes. He just filed a federal lawsuit claiming you defrauded him out of the Senator Hollis investment. Clifton, they're coming after you personally. The morning news anchor's voice cut through the shop radio with surgical precision. Financial consultant Conrad Harwick has filed emergency motions claiming procedural violations in the Briard family power of attorney case. I dropped the wrench I'd been holding. It hit the concrete floor with a clatter that seemed too loud for the moment. Calder appeared in the doorway, phone already to his ear. Lena's pulling the filing now, he said. Harwick is claiming the original POA was obtained through duress and misrepresentation. That's a lie, I said. Garrett brought me those papers himself, told me it was routine estate planning. The radio continued. Harwick's legal team is arguing that the elderly mechanic lacked independent counsel when signing the document that granted his son financial authority over properties now valued at over $1.2 million. Elderly mechanic. They'd reduced 68 years of life to 2 words designed to make me sound helpless. Calder's phone buzzed. He read the screen and his jaw tightened. Harwick's filed 4 separate motions. One claims the POA violates Virginia's statutory witnessing requirements. Another argues you weren't given the mandatory 7-day review period. Was I supposed to get 7 days? That's for health care. PO, as Calder said. He's deliberately mixing up financial and medical documents. Classic misdirection. Lena came through the door carrying her laptop. The witnessing claim is worthless. Virginia only requires 1 witness for financial POAs, and the signature is notarized. But Harwick's attorney is arguing that because Garrett stood to benefit, the document needed 2 disinterested witnesses. What does Wendell say? I asked. Lena set her laptop on the workbench and pulled up a document covered in red margin notes. That Harwick is throwing procedural spaghetti at the wall to see what holds. The real play isn't to win any of these motions. It's to construct a paper trail suggesting you're a confused old man who didn't know what he was putting his name on. I studied Wendell's annotations. Every margin note was a small act of warfare I hadn't asked for but needed badly. Here's the problem. Lena continued. Harwick filed in 3 separate courts at the same time. Superior Court in Chesterfield County Federal District Court in Portsmouth, and he's threatening to petition the Virginia Supreme Court for expedited review. He's forcing us to fight on multiple fronts at once. What comes next is the moment I finally understood how deep this thing went and how long it had been in motion before I ever had a clue. Before I get there, I want to ask you something. If you discovered someone you loved had been quietly working against you for years, would you confront them the moment you found out? Or would you wait, gather every piece of proof, and let the truth do the work? Calder leaned over her shoulder, working through the filings. This is exactly what he did to the Kemps. Bury the victim in procedural objections until they drain their legal budget. Except I'm not paying Wendell, I said. Calder and Lena exchanged a glance I couldn't quite decode. What I asked. Harwick knows that too, Calder said quietly, which means he's not trying to bleed you dry financially. He's building a story. My phone buzzed. Petra Novak's name on the screen. "Mr. Briard," she said when I picked up. "I need you to look at something. Can I come by the shop?" 20 minutes later, Petra had 3 file folders spread across my workbench. Each one held newspaper clippings, court filings, and photographs of men who shared nothing in appearance but one unmistakable thing, the same hollow look I'd been seeing in my own reflection for the past 8 days. "Aldous Fenn," Petra said, pointing to the first folder. 72-year-old retired electrician. His son took power of attorney in 2014, right after Aldous' wife passed. 18 months on, Aldous discovered his pension had vanished. She moved to the second. Clement Baird, 65-year-old pharmacist. His daughter persuaded him to sign POA documents 3 months after his divorce came through. 2 years later, his pharmacy was gone. The third folder showed a face I half recognized from somewhere I couldn't place. Rupert Colby, Petra said, 68 years old, former restaurant owner. His son took POA in 2012, 6 months after Rupert's wife left. By 2014, Rupert was homeless. I don't follow, I said, though something cold had already started forming in my chest. Petra pulled a legal document from each folder and laid them out side by side. "Look at the dates. Aldous signed his POA 4 months after his wife's funeral. Clement signed 3 months after his divorce. Rupert signed 6 months after the separation." Lena moved closer to the table. Garrett approached Clifton with POA documents 8 months after Nadette filed. Petra nodded. "Harwick doesn't just take advantage of family fractures. He targets fathers in very specific emotional windows: grief, divorce, major life upheaval, and then sends the adult children in at carefully timed intervals." Calder picked up Aldous Fenn's file. "How does he find them?" "I don't know yet," Petra admitted. "But there's something else I turned up. In every single case, the adult child had recently brought in a new attorney to handle the POA paperwork, someone with no prior relationship to the family, someone who came with strong recommendations." My throat tightened. Garrett used a lawyer I'd never heard of. Said his usual guy was on vacation. What was the name, Petra asked. I closed my eyes and searched for it. Pendry. Garth Pendry, small office in Chesapeake. Petra's fingers moved fast across her phone. 30 seconds later, she turned the screen toward me. Garth Pendry disbarred in New York in 2016 for ethical violations. Still licensed in Virginia under a reciprocal agreement that shouldn't exist but persists due to a clerical error nobody's gotten around to fixing. "Jesus," Lena whispered. "Harwick didn't just help Garrett defraud you," Petra said. "He supplied the attorney who kept the whole thing legally defensible. And I'd bet Pendry's name shows up in the Fenn, Baird, and Colby files as well." She was right. 10 minutes of cross-referencing settled it. Garth Pendry had notarized documents in all 4 cases. Calder stood in the doorway watching me with an expression I hadn't seen on him before, something between pity and respect. "If Harwick mapped your fracture," he said quietly, "then he already knows your next move. He's 3 steps ahead." The shop phone rang Lena's number on the display, but she was standing right in front of me. Then I understood she'd forwarded her office line. I picked up and heard 2 words that shifted everything. "It's Celeste." The FBI hallway smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. I'd been in that corridor for 3 hours while Garrett signed documents in a room I wasn't permitted to enter. Celeste's call had lasted 4 minutes. She'd caught wind of something from a contact at the courthouse, needed to know whether her father was in legal trouble, and demanded a straight answer. I told her I'd explain everything soon. Then I made the 2-hour drive to Norfolk because Garrett couldn't execute a cooperation agreement without independent counsel. Present, independent meaning vetted by the FBI, which meant this hallway, this waiting, this disinfectant smell that reminded me of the garage but felt nothing like it. Dex Callum came out to update me every 30 minutes with language I didn't entirely follow. Legal terminology that sounded like protection but read like a maze designed to bewilder men who spend their days fixing transmissions. "The new attorney is clean," Dex said on his 3rd pass. "Harwick has no leverage here." "How long?" I asked. "As long as it takes to do it right." I waved off the coffee he offered. My hands needed to stay steady, and caffeine at 11 p.m. would only underscore that I was 68 years old, planted in a plastic chair watching my son sign away whatever was left of his compromised integrity. The conference room door opened at 10:45. Garrett came out first. Lena followed, then a woman in a gray suit I'd never met, the independent counsel, presumably. They moved down the corridor single file, and for a moment I thought they'd all pass me without a word. Garrett stopped 15 feet away. We looked at each other across that distance. Neither spoke. His tie was hanging loose, collar open face, carrying a weariness I knew from my own reflection. He looked like he'd put on 5 years in 9 days. I gave him one nod. Not forgiveness. Recognition. Garrett returned it. Then he turned and walked on toward the elevator. Lena squeezed my shoulder as she came past. "He signed everything," she whispered. "Every page." I watched my son step into the elevator without glancing back. The doors closed with a hydraulic hiss that sounded too final for the moment. Every father wants his son to rise. I'd wanted that part right enough, but I'd misread what rising actually meant. For 42 years, I'd measured Garrett's success by how far he'd traveled from my world: the Ivy League degree, the 6-figure salary, the Georgetown address that ran more per month than I'd cleared in good years. I'd called that escape, called it achievement. I was wrong. Sometimes the most honest flight is simply choosing to do one clean thing after a long run of compromises. Garrett had just signed paperwork that would wreck whatever remained of the career Harwick had built for him. That required a different kind of courage than I'd ever credited him with. Dex walked me to my truck at midnight. "Go home," he said. "Get some sleep. We'll be in touch." I drove back to Portsmouth in silence, reached the garage at 2:30 a.m. and tried to sleep in the office. Couldn't manage it. 48 years I'd assembled engines, knew every bolt, every gasket, every junction where metal met metal. But I'd never understood the structure of my own family until Harwick drew the blueprint for me in blood. Lena called at 9:30 the next morning. Her voice was different, unsettled, not angry. "Dad, you need to hear this directly from him." "What did he say?" "Just come. Now." "Who Judge Croft?" "His private office. He asked for the meeting himself. I made it there in 20 minutes. The judge's chambers looked exactly as I'd imagined: oak paneling, leather chairs anchored beneath diplomas declaring credentials I'd never hold. Fieldon Croft rose when I walked in. He looked 10 years older than his courthouse photograph. Lena pulled the door shut behind us. "Mr. Briard," the judge began, then stopped. Started over. "Clifton, there's something I should have told you 9 days ago." I sat, waited. 12 years ago, your ex-wife walked into my chambers. She brought an envelope. What kind of envelope, I asked. "The kind that ends careers. Mine, my son's, everyone I care about." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. The judge opened a desk drawer and pulled out a file folder worn soft from years of handling. Nadette Briard delivered Conrad Harwick's terms in person. "October 2007, 6 weeks before your divorce was finalized." Lena drew a sharp breath beside me. What terms, I asked, though something cold was already taking hold. Harwick had compiled documentation of minor judicial misconduct from early in my career. Nothing that would have destroyed me alone, but he'd constructed the evidence to implicate my son, who was in law school at the time, as an accomplice. If I didn't cooperate with certain future requests, the documentation would go to the state bar. My son's legal career would be finished before it began. I kept my eyes on the folder. Nadette knew Nadette was the courier, the judge said quietly. "She hasn't been helping Harwick recently. She's been his instrument for 12 years. Your divorce, the timing, the custody terms, Harwick designed all of it." The revelation hit like a piston punch through sheet metal. The judge's hand trembled as he opened the 12-year-old file. I recognized that tremor. It was the same one in my own hands 6 days ago when I first grasped how completely I'd been outmaneuvered. "Do you regret it?" I asked. Judge Croft met my eyes. "Every single day." "Then here is your chance." He closed the file. "What do you mean?" I stood and reached across the desk. "Not forgiveness, opportunity. Testify, hand over the documentation, become a material witness. Harwick's 12-year blackmail operation becomes courtroom evidence. You help the FBI build the RICO case, and you walk out as the man who brought him down, rather than the judge who covered for him." Judge Croft looked at my extended hand. "He'll take everything I have left." "Or you take him down first," I said. "That's your call." He rose and clasped my hand. Firmer grip than I'd expected. "I'll need immunity," he said. "Contact Dex Callum. He'll handle it." I left Lena to work through the details and walked out into the courthouse corridor. My phone sat in my pocket like dead weight. I pulled it out, found Dex's number, and made the call. "Cliff," Dex answered. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," I said. "We are ready. 72 hours. Silence on the line. Then I'll mobilize the team." "Clifton, this better work." "It will," I said. "Because he taught me how." Dex's answer came back carrying the full weight of what lay ahead. 72 hours from now. Either Harwick's in federal custody or we are. I ended the call and turned to find Lena in the courthouse doorway, face drained of color. Dad, she said, voice barely above a whisper. Celeste just called. She knows everything. The conference room at the FBI Norfolk field office held 8 people, 4 laptops, and documentation enough to end Conrad Harwick's career the moment it landed on a judge's desk. Dex Callum had it spread across the table the way a field commander arranges battle maps. Celeste had known everything for 6 days. It turned out Petra Novak had reached out to her directly after the courthouse records went public. My wife spent 48 hours reading through every page, then sat me down in our kitchen and said 3 words. Let's finish this. No accusations, no tears. Just the kind of partnership I'd forgotten a marriage could still be. Now I sat inside a federal building watching prosecutors turn my family's wreckage into legal ammunition. Once we file, there's no pulling back, Dex said. Harwick will know within minutes, Lena said, leaning forward. Good. How long until the warrant executes, I asked. Dex checked his watch. 48 hours maximum. We've coordinated with Harwick's registered counsel. They'll have a window to arrange voluntary surrender. If they refuse, a tactical team moves in for a forced arrest. An assistant U.S. attorney nameplate on the table reading Farlow worked through what looked like phone records. Mr. Briard, I need you to understand what comes next. The moment we file, Harwick's attorneys will launch a media counteroffensive. They'll call this persecution of a successful businessman. They'll say you're a bitter ex-father-in-law grinding an axe. Let them, I said. Farlow nodded. That's the right answer. Dex walked through the evidence methodically. Senator Hollis's SEC filings showing the double hypothecation scheme. Garrett's cooperation testimony laying out how Harwick recruited him at a financial services conference in 2017. Records from 4 prior fraud victims, Aldous Fenn, Clement Baird, Rupert Colby, and Breck Alton, all showing the same blueprint. Judge Croft's 12-year blackmail file. Then Dex opened a digital file I hadn't seen before. Calder's wiretap recordings, he said, and hit play. Harwick's voice came through the conference room speakers, small and tinny, but unmistakable. The Senator Hollis scheme was textbook. Find someone desperate enough to reach for any lifeline offered. Give them exactly what they want, then strip the assets before they can do the arithmetic. I stared at the screen. My nephew wore a wire for 6 months. Lena reached across the table and squeezed my hand. He did it for you. I never asked him to. He volunteered. Dex cut in. Walked in on us in April. Said his uncle was too proud to ask for help, but too decent to deserve what was being done to him. Calder wore that wire into every meeting with Harwick's associates. Every phone call, every transaction review, 63 recordings total, all admissible. I thought about Calder in the shop grease under his fingernails, giving no sign that he was carrying federal surveillance equipment while pulling oil filters. My brother's son, the one I'd always looked after, had spent half a year quietly watching over me. Filing a federal RICO complaint is like dropping a boulder into a glassy pond. The rings spread outward in clean arcs, touching everything, leaving nothing the way it was. Farlow finished her review of the final paperwork at 10:30. At 10:47 a.m., she signed the authorization. The federal criminal complaint was officially on record. RICO charges. Wire fraud, securities fraud, interstate racketeering, maximum exposure 20 years per count. Cleanest RICO package I've seen in 15 years, Farlow said. Dex looked over at me. Clifton built it piece by piece. No, I said. My family built it. The federal magistrate signed the arrest warrant at 11:30 a.m. One ordinary signature that stripped Conrad Harwick of his untouchability and made him a federal fugitive in a single stroke. Dex caught up with me in the hallway outside. You could be present when we bring him in. See him processed, photographed, printed. No, I said. My place is the shop. Call me the second it's over. I drove back to Portsmouth by myself. Lena stayed on with the FBI to track the warrant as it executed. 2 hours through traffic that seemed designed to grind down what little patience I had left. Briard Auto Shop stood just as I'd left it. Bay doors open. Calder bent over a transmission in the afternoon light. Sun slanting through the dust. Old-time gospel drifting from the radio. Calder always acted like it annoyed him, but never once turned it off. All done, Calder said without lifting his head. Filed. Warrants active. Then we wait. We put in 90 minutes of quiet work. Calder rebuilt a clutch assembly. I swapped brake pads on a 2009 Accord that had been sitting untouched for a week. Ordinary tasks, ordinary rhythms. The sort of afternoon that 2 weeks ago would have meant nothing but now had the feel of borrowed time. Nadette came through the bay doors at 2:30. She looked worn down, older than I remembered. Exhausted, the makeup not quite masking the strain around her eyes. She'd always kept every detail in place. Seeing her undone was like watching an actress lose her script mid-performance. "You need to hear this before it goes any further," she said. I stayed at my workbench, didn't offer a chair. "I'm listening." "Harwick has everything from our marriage. Documents, photographs, financial records going back to when you were struggling. He'll put it all out there." I wiped my hands on a shop rag. "And he'll make you look like a failure. A man who couldn't provide. He'll tell everyone about the bankruptcy filing in 1993. The repo. The months you couldn't make the mortgage payments. Nadette." I said quietly, "There is nothing from that marriage I need to hide. I'm a mechanic. I fix transmissions. Some years were hard. I have no secrets beyond motor oil and busted gaskets." She pressed on. "He'll get to Celeste. He'll destroy what you have now." I'd been married to Nadette for 17 years and never once saw her speechless. Turns out plain truth delivered without anger was all it took. "She already knows," I said. "Everything. Harwick has no leverage there." Celeste married a mechanic who sometimes struggled to keep the bills paid. She knew that before the wedding. "You have nothing left." Nadette stood in the doorway for 10 seconds. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. Nothing came. Then she turned and walked out. No goodbye, no parting threat, no final move. Just gone. Calder watched from the bay, wrench in hand. What did she want? To warn me, to threaten me, to save Harwick one more time? What did you tell her? "Nothing," I said. "She's reached the end of her road." We went back to work. The afternoon bled into evening. The phone stayed quiet. Calder wiped his hands on a shop rag and gestured toward the office phone, silent now for 3 hours. Dex had promised to call the moment they had him. It's been 7 hours since the warrant went active. I looked at the clock. 6:47 p.m. Maybe Harwick ran. Then the TV screen split into 4 feeds, every one of them showing FBI agents in windbreakers walking file boxes out of Harwick Corporate's glass tower while morning commuters slowed to stare. Dex had called at 7:42 a.m. We hit at dawn. "Couldn't give you advance notice operational security, but I wanted you to hear it from me before the news broke." Now Calder and I stood in the shop office watching 12 federal agents dismantle Conrad Harwick's empire on live television. 3 news helicopters held orbit over the building. 4 bureau vehicles sealed the street. The image was devastating. "Public, thorough, no walking it back. Every network is covering it," Calder said. "Good. Let everyone see." Dex came through. I watched the agents carry boxes marked evidence down Harwick's marble lobby steps. Each box stood for a victim. Each step was justice, moving at the pace of bureaucracy, slow, methodical, unstoppable. The anchor's voice ran underneath it all. "FBI sources confirmed this is a multi-count RICO investigation involving wire fraud, securities fraud, and interstate racketeering. Conrad Harwick, 63-year-old financial consultant, faces potential federal charges following a year-long investigation." A year long. Dex had been assembling this case before I ever heard Harwick's name. At 9:30, Harwick's attorneys materialized on the courthouse steps. 3 men in suits that cost more than I made in a solid month. The one at the center, silver-haired, wearing a practiced look of concern, delivered a prepared statement to the waiting press. "Mr. Harwick welcomes the opportunity to clear his name and cooperate fully with federal investigators. He maintains his innocence and looks forward to resolution through proper legal channels." "He's not running," I said. "He's fighting." Calder looked at me. "Does that surprise you?" "No. Engineers don't abandon a failing structure. They blame the materials." Harwick had brought in crisis management. The statement was too polished, too carefully constructed, designed to read as cooperative while giving up nothing. He had no intention of running. He was going to fight this with every procedural weapon his money could arm him with. Petra Novak called at 10:45. "Clifton, your phone should be ringing. Every network is asking for you." "Good morning, America, 60 minutes. 3 major papers. They're all after the Angle retired mechanic exposes financial predator." "No," I said. "I understand. What you did here was genuinely remarkable. I kept my family safe. Nothing more than that." She thanked me and said she'd report it fairly. I believed her. Petra had been straight since the beginning, uncommon in this whole ugly affair. Calder moved through the morning quietly, but something behind his movements felt deliberate, calculated. At 11:30, he took out his phone, scrolled for 30 seconds, then pocketed it without a word. 15 minutes on, he did it again. Everything okay? I asked. Yeah, just checking something. Watching your son on television flanked by attorneys and carefully worded regrets is like glimpsing your own face in shattered glass. You know the features. You don't know the man. At 1:15, Calder finished the brake job, rinsed his hands. I have an errand to run. Take your time, I said. He drove off in his truck. I gave him 5 minutes, then went after him. 48 years I'd known my brother's son. Calder didn't slip away on errands mid-shift. Whatever was pulling him out that door mattered enough to lie about. And after watching him carry an FBI wire for 6 weeks without a word to me, I'd learned his silences were worth following. He drove to the Portsmouth Renaissance Hotel. I spent 90 minutes there before I understood why. I parked 3 rows behind him and watched him sit in his truck eyes on his phone. At 2:45, he climbed out and went inside. I followed at a distance. The lobby board made it plain. Briard Press Conference, Windsor Ballroom, 3 p.m. Garrett. I took the stairs to the second floor. Through the half-open ballroom doors, I could see the arrangement, a podium loaded with microphones, 2 attorneys beside an empty chair, 15 reporters setting up equipment. Garrett walked in at 2:58. Thinner than I remembered and older. A suit that probably ran $3,000 and an expression of crafted remorse that cost even more. I stayed in the corridor. The press conference opened at 3 o'clock sharp. Garrett worked through prepared notes in that practiced register of wounded sincerity I'd watched him use on clients. I deeply regret my involvement in activities I didn't fully understand. Mr. Harwick exploited my trust in my family relationships. I look forward to cooperating fully with federal authorities to ensure justice is served. Polished, rehearsed, almost convincing. Then Calder came through the side door. He walked to the podium without a word. Garrett stopped mid-sentence, confused. Reporters glanced up from their notebooks. Calder unclipped his Apple Watch and connected it to the podium's sound system. The room went still. Then Garrett's voice poured through the speakers, not the Garrett standing there now, but a recording from 6 months prior. The old man won't notice. He barely understands basic accounting. A pause, then a voice I didn't recognize. And the second loan. Garrett again. Harwick will cover it through the shell company. By the time Dad figures out what happened, the properties will be liquidated. The recording ran 14 seconds. Garrett's silence after it lasted the rest of his life. Calder leaned into the microphone, voice level. You said he wouldn't notice, but he notices everything. Garrett said nothing. His attorney surged toward the front, but the damage was already done. Every camera had it. Every recorder had it. Calder had just gutted his cousin's victim narrative in front of the full press corps. I stood in the hallway listening to the room come apart. Shouted questions. Garrett's attorneys calling for order. Calder slipping out through the side exit without a backward look. My face felt strange. I pressed my fingers to my cheek and they came away wet. I was crying. 68 years old. I hadn't cried since my father's funeral in 1984. 35 years of holding the line through divorce money troubles, raising 3 children, building a business from bare concrete. But standing there listening to my nephew deliver justice while my son stood silent at a podium, something gave way. Not for Garrett. For the son I had set out to raise, for the man I had expected him to become, for the father I had somehow failed to be. I stood in that hallway with tears on my face, 68 years old, weeping for the first time since I buried my father. My nephew's voice, on one side of that wall, delivering what the courts had not yet managed. My son's silence on the other. The one decent thing he did that day. By the time Helene Fenner reached the shop that evening, I'd gone over the office floor with a broom twice and put coffee on. Neither of us was going to drink it, but some gestures matter apart from what they accomplish. I'd driven back from the hotel without the radio, past reporters still staked out in the parking lot, past Calder standing calm at the center of a storm he'd built with 14 seconds of tape. I was back by 4:30, 2 hours before the widow arrived. Calder found me rearranging 2 chairs for the 3rd time. The court hasn't ordered restitution yet, he said. I know. You're doing this because it's right. I'm doing it because it's overdue. The check was already written. $85,000, the exact amount Garrett and Harwick had taken from Artie Fenner's retirement account. I'd moved funds from the shop's reserve account that afternoon. Wendell had called it premature. I'd called it necessary. Calder leaned in the doorframe watching me rehearse words I'd never get right. She doesn't expect this. That's why it matters. Helene Fenner arrived at 6:30 carrying a shop jacket I knew on sight, name patch above the left pocket. Artie. She was 62 years old, smaller than I'd pictured, silver hair in a bun, carrying the kind of worn-down dignity that settles into a person after burying a husband and finding his savings hollowed out in the same wretched year. Mrs. Fenner, I said, rising. You didn't have to see me privately, she said. Yes, I did, the attorney said. This isn't for the attorneys. I showed her to the chair. She sat. I poured coffee. We left it untouched. Your husband was the finest mechanic in 48 years of running this shop, I said. She kept the jacket across her lap, holding it carefully as if it might not hold together. He loved this place. Artie could hear a transmission problem before the instruments caught it. Trained 3 apprentices who are still in the trade today. Built engines that didn't give out. He was a craftsman. Helene's fingers moved over the name patch. He told me it was the last honest shop he ever worked in. Came home every night with oil under his nails and never said a word against it. Said honest work smells different. He deserved far better than what my son handed him. She looked up at me. He died 3 weeks before the bank called about the missing funds. Sometimes I think that was a mercy. Artie would have found a way to blame himself. Turned it back onto his own shoulders somehow. I knew that kind of man. I'd spent most of my life being one. She sat there holding her husband's jacket, 22 months gone, and the cloth still carried the smell of motor oil and Old Spice cologne. The investigator told us it was a shell company, Helene went on. Artie believed he was buying municipal bonds, safe, steady, the unglamorous sort of investment that lets you stop working at 65 instead of 70. Harwick guaranteed 6% annual return, 0 risk. There's always risk, I said. Artie understood that, but Harwick had credentials. References a glass tower office in Washington, D.C., and your son had personally vouched for him. Called our house, talked to Artie for 40 minutes about protecting what you've built. My husband trusted that man because he was Clifton Briard's son. Each word hit like something solid. I pushed the check across the desk. $85,000. Today's date. Made out to Helene Fenner. She looked at it and didn't touch it. What is this? The courts will get to restitution in time, I said. This is now. You have no legal obligation here. The obligation I carry isn't legal, that's enough. Helene took the check in both hands, read it once, set it down, read it again, picked it back up. This is everything Artie lost. She said it quietly. Yes, your son stole it, not you. My son bears my name. Bore it anyway. His debts are mine until a judge rules differently. And even then, she folded the check with care, put it in her purse, and looked at me with eyes that had absorbed more loss than most people ever know. Artie said something to our son before he died. I'd like you to hear it. I waited. He said, Boss Briard doesn't say much, but he always builds it straight. You can trust a man like that with your transmission or your truth. Same thing, really. My throat closed. I failed your husband. I got there on my own. You got there standing up, Helene said. Your son's the one who made the mess. You're the one mopping it up. That's not the same thing. I walked her out to her car without a word between us. Artie's jacket was folded over her arm, her purse, the check inside it, in her other hand. She said thank you at the door. I gave her a nod. She pulled out and was gone. 7:15 the next morning, I unlocked the shop, started a pot of coffee, and pulled up the news on my tablet. The U.S. attorney had moved overnight criminal complaint publicly unsealed. I stood at the counter reading while the coffee dripped through the tablet propped against the register. Conrad Harwick taken into federal custody, bail hearing on the calendar for November 1st. RICO as the anchor charge layered with conspiracy, wire fraud, securities, fraud, interstate racketeering. Maximum exposure on the lead count, 20 years. Garrett's name surfaced in the cooperation agreement subsection. Wire fraud, mail fraud, bank fraud. Sentencing recommendation tied to the quality of what he delivered. I kept reading until I hit the defendant identification section. It said Garrett Harwick, formerly known as Garrett Briard, age 42, residing at 147 Georgetown Boulevard, New York, New York. I put the tablet down, then picked it back up and went through it a second time. Garrett Harwick. My son had gone to the trouble of making it legal, cut the family name out of his life in writing in federal court filings that would sit in public record until the building crumbled. He traded Briard for Harwick. Good. I drank my coffee. It was already cold. Empty, then flooded, then empty again. That was the sequence. But the structure held. The name Briard still meant something in Portsmouth. 48 years. Every job priced straight. Every engine built to go the distance. Garrett had given up any claim to that legacy. Calder came in at 8 o'clock, clocked the tablet on the counter, found the line that mattered without any direction from me. How are you holding up? I thought about it the way the question deserved. I feel correct, I told him. Not good. Correct. That enough for you? Has to be. He filled a mug and settled back against the workbench, looking me over the way a mechanic sizes up an engine he's not sure about, the same look I'd caught on my own face in the mirror more than once. "Pop always said you were stubborn," he said, keeping his voice low. "But I'm not sure that was the word he was after." I looked up. What word was he after? Calder's answer arrived the same way his thinking always did, unhurried, solid, not going anywhere. The shop held nothing but the two of us and the Camaro. By 10:30 he'd headed home, the bay doors bolted, just me under the fluorescent hum with 4 decades of quiet pressing down. Immovable. His words trailed me around the shop as I worked. At 19, I'd refused to sell during the 2003 collapse, and my father called it stubbornness. My ex-wife pinned the same label on me the year I turned down Philadelphia because she wanted to chase a promotion. Maybe every one of them was pointing at the same thing Calder was. Maybe immovable is just what it looks like when a person decides what counts and won't be argued out of it. I came back to the carburetor on the workbench, the 1964 Camaro built with Garrett in mind, though he never did a thing to deserve it. 18 months into this restoration started back when he first said he'd always wanted something classic, back before the picture came into focus, before I saw what Harwick had shaped him into. The radio stayed dark, just metal on metal and the sound of my own breath. This was how I sorted things out. Keep the hands moving. Let the mind work the problem like a parts bin. Find the piece that fits. Seat it right. Make it last. The shop phone rang at 10:47. I glanced up from the carburetor. Calls didn't come in this late. A wrong number, most likely, or some reporter who dug the landline out of a public database. Then it rang again. Garrett was due to surrender to federal custody the following morning at 9. I'd been through the court order 3 times already. Marshals would process him, then move him to a federal holding facility while he waited on sentencing. 3 to 5 years, the way Dex had walked me through the plea. 3rd ring. Might be Garrett. Probably not. Probably some automated pitch for an extended warranty. 4th ring. I crossed to the office, stopped in the doorway, watched the light on the handset pulse. Caller ID said unknown. On the 5th ring, I picked up and held the receiver without speaking. Just waited. The line wasn't empty. It wasn't that kind of quiet. I'd learned to tell. There was breathing on the other end, measured with a small catch on every inhale. I placed it before I could name it. Garrett. I pressed the phone to my ear and said nothing. He said nothing back. My free hand found the desk edge, and I lowered myself into the chair I'd been sitting in for 48 years. The old vinyl gave its familiar creak. A minute went by. Then another. Neither of us reached for the button to end it. Phone silence isn't the same creature as room silence. It carries mass. Texture, it means someone on the far end is also choosing to leave the air unfilled right alongside you. 3 minutes of 2 people breathing across a wire. No language, because language meant either lies or the truth, and both had too high a price that night. Just 2 men acknowledging the other was still there, bound by telephone cable and blood and the wreckage between them. Neither able to start, neither able to walk away. Then at the 3-minute mark, Garrett spoke. "I am sorry." Thin. Worn down to the grain. Nothing left of the voice that had signed his name Harwick. Nothing of the voice that had sold financial products to people saving for old age. What was left was the layer underneath all of it, the voice I'd known when he was 7, when he smashed my workbench trying to nail together a birdhouse he hadn't asked anyone how to build. 3 words. No defense attached, no appeal for mercy, no attempt to negotiate, just the bare statement. And underneath it I could hear everything that didn't make it into the sentence. Sorry for what he took. Sorry for the years of lying. Sorry for trading my name for Harwick's. Sorry for turning into the exact thing I'd spent his whole childhood steering him away from. Sorry for all of it, knowing that sorry couldn't be calibrated against a loss this size. I counted to 10 each second, deliberate, before I let myself answer. Forgiveness wasn't on the table. I wasn't anywhere near that door, but there was something I could give him, something true. 2 words. I know. And I did. I knew he meant it. The 3 minutes of silence before he could speak said so. The fracture in his voice said so. The fact that he'd picked up the phone at all on the last night before the government took the rest of his freedom, that said so too. None of it rewrote what had happened. Didn't reduce the damage by $1. Didn't return Artie Fenner's husband. Didn't give me back the year Harwick consumed. Didn't seal up the break that now ran through the middle of my family. But the sorrow was real. I knew it. I set down the receiver without a farewell. He didn't try again. I gave the phone 30 seconds, then went back to the Camaro and put my hand on the wrench. The carburetor wasn't weighing apologies or counting down to a sentencing date. It didn't care whose father couldn't find his way to forgiveness. It needed torque and patience and a steady hand. Thread the bolt clockwise, torque to spec. Do it right. I stayed until 11:15, then stepped away to look at where things stood. The arithmetic wasn't complicated. 3 to 5 years under the plea. This Camaro had maybe 6 months left in it. I'd already put in 18 months, and I knew exactly what remained between here and finished. The car would be done well ahead of Garrett. So what becomes of a car you built for a son who's no longer the person you built it for? I ran another bolt down and thought it through. Selling made sense. A fully restored '69 Camaro original engine block the right buyer could go to $40,000. Enough to carry the shop's overhead for another year and not touch the reserves. Or give it to Calder. He'd earned a claim to it that Garrett never had. 6 months wired up for the FBI, betting everything on protecting a brother who hadn't spared him much thought in 2 decades. Or hold it, wait out the sentence. 3 years on the low end, 5 on the high. Federal time runs at 85%, so the real math was 2.5 to 4.25 years. The Camaro would occupy a bay, finished and idle burning space I could fill with paying work standing there every morning to remind me of the full accounting. I stepped back and took it in midnight blue under the shop lights, chrome catching the fluorescence engines 60% along solid and honest and made to last. Perhaps I'd hold on to it. Not a commitment, not forgiveness, not even a firm decision, more like leaving the latch off a door I wasn't ready to bolt shut, just a perhaps. I cleaned my hands on the shop rag and gave the Camaro one last look before I cut the lights. Perhaps I'd keep it until he came home. Perhaps. It sat out there in the dark like a sentence missing its period. Not a vow, not absolution, only the refusal of a man who knew how to be immovable to go ahead and make it permanent. 14 days after Garrett walked into federal custody, I took a seat in a federal courtroom in Portsmouth and listened to 340 families put words to what my son had taken from them. That time belongs to them. I can't give it back. Trust I can never restore. The Camaro stayed in the shop bay under a tarp. Perhaps it wasn't a decision yet, just a state of suspension, like everything else in those 2 weeks, caught between what had already happened and whatever was coming next, waiting to feel which way the weight would fall. Calder rode with me to the federal courthouse that November morning. The front steps were thick with victims' attorneys and camera crews jostling for angles. Dex Callum gave me a nod from across the lobby. I had on my only suit, the one I'd worn to my father's funeral in 1984. Still fit. It felt wrong on me for this occasion. "You don't have to put yourself through this," Calder said as we neared the courtroom doors. "Yes, I do. They're not holding you responsible. That doesn't change what I owe." The courtroom was full by 9:45. Harwick sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit, hands folded in his lap face, giving nothing away. His lawyers bracketed him on both sides, propping up something that had already fallen. Garrett was absent, already transferred to the federal facility in Cumberland, Maryland. 3 to 5 years cooperating witness, no bail. The judge, a woman in her 60s whose nameplate read Martinez, outlined the victim impact procedures. 12 speakers on the schedule, 3 minutes each. Helene Fenner was 7th on the list. The first 6 came up and told variations of the same story. Retirement accounts wiped out, college funds gone, medical savings dissolved. One woman, 74 years old, a retired schoolteacher, described how she'd been putting money aside to help her granddaughter with student loans. Past tense. Had been. Not anymore. Harwick stared straight ahead through every word of it. No flinching, no glance toward the speakers. I'd seen that technique before, the way engineers learn to treat mechanical failure as a structural problem rather than a human one. Separate the numbers from the people behind them. At 11:15, Helene Fenner walked to the witness box carrying her husband's shop jacket folded over her arm, the navy blue name patch above the pocket. Artie, she had written remarks prepared. I could see the page in her other hand, but she never looked down at it. She spoke straight to Judge Martinez. "My husband Artie worked 43 years as a mechanic," Helene said. Her voice didn't waver. "He saved $85,000. Mr. Harwick took it in 6 weeks. She paused, laid the jacket across the rail of the witness stand. "Artie died without knowing he'd been robbed. I'm grateful for that. He went believing in himself, believing he'd taken care of me. That matters." Judge Martinez leaned in slightly. "Mrs. Fenner, is there anything else you'd like the court to consider?" Helene nodded. "The court record shows that one person stepped forward to compensate victims before any legal order required it. Clifton Bryard, the father of the man who helped destroy us." She looked directly across at me and held it. "I can't tell you what that says about justice, Your Honor, but I know what it says about Mr. Bryard." She picked up Artie's jacket, nodded once, and stepped down. When someone stands in a courtroom full of people your son betrayed and says something like that about you, you don't feel vindicated. You feel the full mass of every choice yours, his everyone's that put all of you in that room together. I sat without moving, gave no sign, made no acknowledgement. My jaw tightened. I felt it happen, a small shift in the muscle, but that was the only thing that moved. Calder was watching from the seat beside me. I didn't need to look to know it. The hearing ran on. 5 more speakers, more accounts of theft dressed up as investment counsel, more shattered plans, more misplaced trust. Harwick held his position through every statement. We left at noon and drove back to Portsmouth without a word passing between us. 3 days later, I was eating lunch at the shop and pulled up the news. The financial wire services were reporting that Harwick's legal team had filed motions cutting all business ties with former associates. Standard defensive maneuvering, limit exposure, sever connections, put distance between the defendant and anyone attached to him. 17 names in the filing. Nadette Briard on line 8. All financial arrangements terminated immediately. All contractual obligations voided. All protective agreements canceled. I put down the sandwich I hadn't been eating and followed the link to the follow-up piece. The terms were laid out without sentiment. Biloxi casino debt carried for years by Harwick through a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands had been handed back to the original creditors. Legal cover Harwick had run for 12 years gone. Nadette was now facing the casinos on her own. Estimated exposure $340,000. Harwick had set her aside the way you set aside a tool that no longer serves the job. No ceremony about it, just use and discard. I read the article twice. What I felt wasn't anything close to satisfaction, just a deep, accumulated tiredness. The kind that settles into the bone when you watch people wreck themselves and can't quite calculate how much of it belongs to their own decisions versus the person who handed them the means. Calder came into the office with 2 coffees, set one on the desk in front of me, and saw what was on the tablet screen. "You read it." I nodded. "Will you reach out to her?" "No." Calder settled into the chair across from my desk, worked at his coffee, and let the silence stretch. "Why not?" he eventually asked. I closed the tablet and looked at my nephew, 26 years old, 6 weeks of FBI cooperation, one devastating press conference behind him, and somehow still wired to wonder whether people needed someone to pull them clear. "Not because I haven't forgiven her," I said. "Because there's nothing left for me to tell her that she hasn't already told herself." Nadette had spent 12 years carrying Harwick's leverage and working to pull my family apart. She'd walked blackmail into Judge Croft's chambers. She'd smoothed the path for Garrett's reinvention. She'd picked Harwick's shelter over every other option available to her again and again. Now that shelter was gone, and the bill had come due on everything she'd been pushing forward for over a decade, what was I supposed to offer? "Sorry I didn't warn you. The man you spent 12 years helping him dismantle this family just dismantled you, and all I have left is tired." "She made her choices," I said. Calder nodded slowly, set his cup down. "And you made yours?" "Yes. You can't be responsible for saving every person who ends up in the wreckage." "I know. Do you?" Calder asked. I didn't answer. I picked up my wrench and walked back out to the bay where the Camaro sat waiting under the tarp. Work didn't ask philosophical questions. It asked for your hands and your attention and the discipline to do the thing correctly. Calder followed me out, took up his place against the workbench while I stripped the tarp off the Camaro and raised the hood. He watched me with the look I'd learned to read, the one where he was measuring whether to press or let something lie. He decided to press. "Dad always figured you were too proud to ask for help," he said, choosing his words. "But maybe it's more that you're too honest to take comfort you don't feel you've got coming." I put the wrench to the engine and didn't answer. Some observations are complete without a response. The envelope turned up on a Tuesday morning. No return address, just my name written in careful script across heavy paper that carried weight in the hand, the kind used for formal correspondence. Calder's remark from the day before was still with me. Too honest to accept comfort I didn't think I'd earned. Maybe that was right. I'd worked until dark without saying a word back to him, and he'd let it go. Some things land more cleanly without being discussed. I opened it at the desk. 2 pages handwritten in fountain pen. Judge Fieldencroft's personal letterhead embossed at the top. Not a legal document, something that had cost him more than that. I read it standing, coffee going cold at my elbow. No preamble. "Mr. Briard, I have not slept through the night in 12 years. Not since October 2007, when your ex-wife walked into my chambers carrying Conrad Harwick's envelope." I set the coffee down. The judge's hand was precise, controlled, the kind you develop when years of writing orders that reshape lives have trained the pen into steadiness. He described watching his son's legal career take shape: Georgetown Law Review, a federal clerkship, a partnership track at a Washington, D.C. firm. All of it built on ground the judge understood was compromised by what he'd stayed silent about. Every case I heard, every ruling I issued, every oath I administered, all of it stained by the choice I'd made not to come forward. I told myself I was protecting my son. What I was really protecting was my own cowardice. The second page, I self-reported my conduct to the Virginia Advisory Committee on Judicial Conduct on November 18th. I submitted full documentation of Harwick's blackmail, my acceptance of his terms, and my 12-year silence. I requested a full investigation and accepted whatever follows. The final paragraph read, "I maintained my silence for 12 years. Because of you, I am silent no longer. Whatever the commission decides, I will face it knowing I finally made the right call 12 years late but correct nonetheless." Signed simply, Fielden. I folded it along its original creases and placed it in my desk drawer alongside the old power of attorney document Garrett had brought to me 2 years ago. 2 pieces of paper in the same drawer, one the record of broken faith, one the record of courage finding its way through late. I didn't write back. There was nothing to add. What he'd done spoke on its own. Late November weekend. Calder and I put in hours on the Camaro, engine rebuilt, chrome polished, interior restored. What remained was the electrical system and brake calibration. 18 months into this restoration, the finish line had come into view. We worked in easy, quiet passing tools back and forth without needing to ask, a rhythm built up over months of working side by side. Rebuilding an engine and rebuilding a relationship follow the same logic. You can't skip the steps and expect the thing to run clean. Around 3 p.m., Calder straightened up from under the hood, cleaned his hands on a rag, and asked me straight out, "Do you have regrets about Garrett?" I stopped mid-torque, gave the question the weight it deserved. 30 seconds went by before I answered. Calder didn't hurry me. "I regret thinking that leaving him entirely to his own devices was how you love someone," I said at last. "I built that relationship wrong, mistook independence for abandonment, distance for strength. I taught Garrett how to survive but never how to reach out. I handed him tools but never gave him ground to stand on. I put the wrench down. He made his choices. That's on him. But I made mine first. I could have taught him something different, could have shown him that asking for help isn't the same as failing. That family isn't a thing you get away from. It's something you put together on purpose." Calder nodded, turned back toward the engine and said quietly without looking up, "You won't build it wrong with me. I know." We stayed at it until the light died, then sat with the Camaro in the growing dark, neither one of us talking. Some things don't need to be said out loud. Sometimes all it takes is being there. Tools shared, labor, a common purpose. Late November, I drove to Lena's law office to update the trust documents. Post-crisis revisions, removing Garrett, repositioning assets, clarifying who stood to inherit what. Lena laid the paperwork across her desk and walked me through each change in sequence. Then she asked, "Do you want to bring Calder into the trust inheritance provisions business succession?" I looked at the papers, then at my daughter across that mahogany desk. "He isn't my son on paper, but he's a Briard." Lena set down her pen and fixed me with a look I'd only seen once before the day she passed the bar and told me she'd never take work from anyone who fell short of the standard I'd set. "We can fix the paper part," she said. What did she mean? Adult adoption. Virginia Code Section 63.2-1243, subsection 4. You're 68, Calder is 26. Age difference clears 15 years. You've shared a residence for over a year. Every statutory requirement is satisfied. She said she could file the petition that same week. I stared at her. Adoption. Full legal adoption. Calder Briard would become my son in every sense the law recognized. Inheritance rights, name rights, the full set of familial protections. She turned toward Calder, who'd been sitting quietly in the corner the whole time. "This is your call, too. He can't adopt you without your agreement." 10 seconds of silence. Calder looked at me. I looked back. Nobody spoke. Then Calder said, "Let's do it." Lena nodded once, made notes on her legal pad. "I'll draft the petition tonight. Filing fee is $165. Court hearing in roughly 60 days. The judge will review the relationship, confirm the requirements, issue the decree." She looked up. "After that, Calder Briard is legally your son. The Briard name passes to someone who earned it. That matters." I nodded. Couldn't find words. Didn't need to. Lena gathered her papers, slid them into a folder she labeled Briard Family Trust Amended. set it to the side, stood. "We're done here," she said, "for now." The three of us walked out together, Calder on my right, Lena on my left. No one said anything as we crossed the parking lot in the November dusk. The family I'd lost, Garrett, who'd traded the Briard name for Harwick's Nadette, who'd spent 12 years helping burn everything down, had been replaced by the family I'd assembled through choice, through work, through the kind of respect you can't manufacture. Not blood. Something more durable than that. Calder would carry the Briard name forward not because he was born to it, but because he'd earned it through 6 weeks on an FBI Wire 1 devastating press conference interruption, and 18 months of restoring a Camaro beside a man who was learning to rebuild relationships the same way he rebuilt engines. We stepped out of Lena's office into the November twilight. My son on my right, my daughter on my left, no words needed. Behind us in that building, paperwork waited to make official what had already become real. The name would go on, just not the way I'd imagined 42 years ago. Garrett walked into the shop on a Tuesday in December one day before he was due to check into FCI Petersburg, and I knew before he said a word that he'd come to ask for something I couldn't give. The adoption papers had cleared the week before. Calder Briard officially legally. The court decree came in a manila envelope that felt heavier in the hand than 2 pages of legal text had any business feeling. We'd marked it quietly coffee at the shop counter, a handshake that went on a beat longer than handshakes usually do. Building family the same way I built engines, deliberately, precisely, one connection at a time. Now Garrett was standing in the bay doorway in civilian clothes, too clean for this place. I was under a Honda Civic when I saw his shoes, leather Oxfords, polished, expensive. Calder, working in the next bay over, stopped mid-wrench and watched. Neither of us said anything. I rolled out from under the car, got to my feet, wiped my hands down. Garrett moved through the shop the way a man moves through a place he knows he's losing, slowly taking stock. He touched the workbench where I'd first put tools in his hands at 12, ran his fingers along the maple edge, 40 years of oil worked into the grain gouges where parts had dropped, then stopped at the Briard Auto Shop sign his grandfather had commissioned in 1971. Hand-painted gold leaf lettering. Never replaced. Then he found the Camaro midnight blue chrome alive under the shop lights. Engine complete, rebuilt, balanced, and tuned. 18 months of work. His inheritance finished without him. Garrett stood in front of it for 30 seconds, didn't reach out, just looked. His knees went, not for effect, not performed, his body simply couldn't hold the load anymore. He came down on the concrete, one hand catching the fender to break the fall, the other hitting the floor, hard enough that I heard it. 60 days of legal proceedings, cooperation, testimony, the name change, the public humiliation, Calder's press conference, Harwick cutting him loose, all of it arriving at once. My son kneeling on the same floor where I'd taught him to change oil when he was 14. I didn't go to him. Calder moved in the next bay, and I raised one hand just slightly. "Wait," Garrett looked up from the floor, voice worn thin. "I want to take back the Briard name. Not a demand, not negotiating, just asking the only thing he had left that he thought might still mean something." I stood over my biological son, wrench in hand, on concrete my father poured 50 years ago, and I considered the request. "No," I said. Garrett's face collapsed. "Dad, the Briard name belongs to people who know how to live with it honorably," I said. Quiet. No anger in it. "You chose Harwick, changed it legally, filed the documents, made it official." I set the wrench down. "You keep Harwick. Take it in with you. Serve your time under the name you picked. Maybe 3 to 5 years from now, you'll understand what it means to earn a name instead of being handed one. I made mistakes. You made choices." I said it plainly. Deliberate choices over 2 years. You chose Harwick's guidance, his methods, what he stood for. You chose to steal from families who trusted you because my name had vouched for you. You chose to swap your name to his when the bill came due. Garrett looked down at the floor. "I'm sorry." "I know you are." "That doesn't change my answer." "Then what do I have?" I looked at my son on the floor of my shop. Took the question seriously. "You have 3 to 5 years to figure out who Garrett Harwick actually is," I said finally. "When you come out the other side, if you've done that honestly, not just going through the motions, we'll talk. Until then, you have exactly what you chose to have." Garrett got up slowly, using the Camaro's fender to push himself to standing. His hand left a smudge on chrome I'd buffed out 3 days ago. He looked at me one last time. No anger, no appeal. Just the settled look of a man who'd already known the answer before he walked through the door. He turned and headed for the exit. Calder stepped back. Garrett went past him without a word through the bay doors and out into the December cold. I heard his car start a Lexus sedan, probably headed for a repossession lot inside the month. Heard it pull away. Gone. Calder and I stood there for 60 seconds without speaking. "You okay?" he asked finally. "Yes." "You sure?" "I'm sure." We went back to work. The next morning came in like any other. The first genuinely ordinary morning since the October gala. No urgent calls, no FBI status updates, no lawyers, no reporters. Just December sunrise at 6:45 a.m. I got to the shop, started the coffee in the pot that had been running since 1982. Flipped on the radio, old-time gospel playing from the radio, something about grace finding its way home. Sat at the desk and went through the work orders. 3 cars and Q transmission, brake job, engine diagnostic. Calder came in at 7, wearing his work shirt, now officially embroidered Calder Briard before the adoption papers cleared. He'd had it done the day the decree arrived, poured himself coffee, rolled his neck, looked at the schedule board. "What's on today?" The most ordinary question there is. I looked out across the shop floor, the tools, the waiting cars, the Camaro gleaming under its tarp in the corner. "We fix cars," I said, 3 of them waiting. Calder nodded. "Good, let's get to it." Clean water after a long drought. That's what ordinary work is. Absence teaches gratitude faster than anything else. Coffee in hand. I watched Calder work through the first bay, precise, unhurried, every movement shaped by proper training. Let my mind run forward. 48 years ago, I raised this shop from nothing, just me and a set of tools and whoever came through the door. My father lent me $5,000 to get started. I cleared that debt inside 18 months. What I built after was reputation, fair prices, straight answers. 3 kids grew up in the rooms above those bays before we ever had a proper house. I could do it again the same way. 1 transaction, 1 vehicle, 1 day. Only difference, somebody would be standing next to me. Calder, my son now, by law and by deliberate choice. Lena, lawyer, counsel, daughter, who'd sat beside me through federal courtrooms and victim impact hearings. Celeste, my wife, who'd held the line without grievance once she understood what the fight was about. That circle was enough. More than enough. I set down my mug and crossed to the first job, waiting a 2009 Accord transmission gone. Calder had the bay prep tools arranged in the sequence I'd drilled into him. The Camaro rested behind us, finished catching light. Ahead, just work. No explanations owed to anyone. 3 years and 2 months since I'd cracked open the 1964 Camaro, and now Calder turned the key, and it fired on the first try. Contained Thunder precision, holding power in check exactly as a properly built engine should sound. That Accord transmission ran 4 days. Plain work. December sliding into January, nothing headline-worthy, but the kind of labor that settles the accounts and keeps your hands from going idle. When 2020 arrived, the whole ordeal had taken on the texture of someone else's memory, except for the Camaro in the bay, nearly done, still waiting. One January morning, shop doors wide open to cold white sun. The Camaro occupied the center bay. Midnight blue paint, flawless. Chrome throwing light back at you. Engine rebuilt from the ground up. 18 months of deliberate work, not a detail skipped. Calder and I made one slow circuit around it. I went over the valve covers. He went over the brake lines, each bolt seated where it belonged. "It's perfect," Calder said. "It's correct," I replied. "That's better than perfect." He settled into the driver's seat, spotted the key on the dash, met my eyes through the glass. I nodded. Key turned. Engine answered immediately. Deep V8 rumble, smooth, idle. No knock, no hesitation, no miss. 3 years compressed into 5 seconds, and every second confirmed the work had held. "Listen to that," he called through the open window. 428 cubic inches of Detroit iron, I said. "Built correctly." Calder took her around the block. 10 minutes later, he eased it to the curb, out front, climbed out, buffed his fingerprints off the chrome before I said a word. "Runs clean," he said. "Yes." Lena pulled up while he was still at it, made a slow loop around the Camaro. "Quality work, no shortcuts." 3 years, she said. "You actually finished it. An engineer always finishes what he starts. What will you do with it?" I looked north up the road toward FCI Petersburg, where Garrett had reported in 2 months ago. Minimum release, October 2022. Maximum October 2024. "I think I'll hold on to it," I said. Lena followed my gaze and didn't need it spelled out. "Dad, you don't owe him." "I know." "Then why?" I turned back to the Camaro. Midnight blue soaking up the January sun. Chrome without a flaw. An engine that hums the way justice sounds when the construction is correct. Not as forgiveness, I said. Not as a reward, just as a possibility. I built this for a son who doesn't exist anymore. Maybe I'll keep it for a man who might. You spend 68 years mastering engines, and somewhere along the way you're supposed to get equally good at families. I got one right before I figured out the other. Calder stood beside me, shoulder to shoulder. My son, not by birth, by choice, by labor, by trust, rebuilt through crisis. A man who carried an FBI wire for 6 weeks after the October recording to shield someone too proud to ask for it, who spent 18 months on this engine alongside me, who stayed when leaving would have cost him less. Lena, on my other side, who'd sat through federal courtrooms and victim impact hearings with me, who'd filed the adoption papers that made Calder legally mine, who'd never once wavered. "Come on," I said. "Work orders are waiting inside." We walked back in together. The Camaro held its place in the winter sun, not waiting on anything specific, just waiting the way certain things are built to do. 3 years ago, I'd started that car believing it was a gift. It turned out to be a lesson in what right construction actually demands, in knowing what to hold and what to release, in the distance between bloodline and family. Maybe Garrett would walk out in 3 years carrying something different, maybe not. Either way, the car would be here. Correct. Complete. Ready. An engineer never strips something down without a blueprint for what replaces it. Ready. I stripped a great deal down that year. A son's grip on my name, my faith in family bonds, my assumptions about loyalty and blood. But the blueprint was never missing. Calder, Lena, Celeste, honest work. If you've stayed with me this long, then you already know this wasn't really a story about a car or a shop or a piece of paper someone signed. It was about what happens when the people you built your life around decide your life is something they can use. I lost years to this. I lost the version of a son I thought I was raising. I lost the easy faith I once had in the word family. But I believe God doesn't strip things away without leaving something truer in their place, and what was left when the wreckage cleared was Calder, Lena, Celeste, and the quiet dignity of honest work. That turned out to be more than enough. If these grandpa revenge stories have taught me anything worth passing on, it's this. Never sign what you haven't read, not for a child, not for a spouse, not for anyone who makes you feel that asking questions is an insult. When someone rushes your trust, slow down. Urgency is often the first tool a con uses. Blood is a fact. Family is a choice. The people who stay when staying costs them something, those are your people. And if you're a father carrying one of these father stories inside you, the kind where you gave everything and still got it wrong, know that getting it wrong once doesn't close the account. You rebuild. One day, one honest transaction, one trustworthy person at a time. If this story moved you, leave a thought in the comments. I read everyone. If you know someone who needs to hear it, share it with them today. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to Grandpa's Revenge so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.